Mic check. Is it working? Yeah? Okay, all right. So good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our today's conference on sustainable finance that we are proud to host live from the FinTech House in Lisbon. We are proud to have gathered more than 10 sustainable finance experts from Portugal and abroad. They will be sharing their experiences, discuss how financial institutions are incorporating sustainability into their strategies, and how on their day-to-day they manage ESG risks and harness the immense economic opportunities stemming from the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We want you joining us virtually to be an active part of the conversation, and we encourage you to submit your questions using the web conferencing tool. Throughout the conference, we will have opportunities for you to submit your questions. To open the conference and set the stage, we would like to welcome Luis Lagina de Sousa, who is an executive board member at the Bank of Portugal, to give us his opening remarks.
Bem, muito bom dia a todos. Quero começar por agradecer, na pessoa do Dr. Paulo Soares de Oliveira, o convite que me foi endereçado. Eu gostaria de saudar os oradores que irão intervir ao longo desta manhã e também todos os que estão aqui a assistir fisicamente na sala e virtualmente através do streaming. É com enorme gosto que eu estou na abertura deste evento, promovido pela PSO, e dedicado ao tema do financiamento sustentável e dos riscos e oportunidades que representa para o sistema financeiro português. Trata-se de um tópico que é dos poucos que rivaliza em termos de atenção e importância com o outro tópico que nos apanhou de surpresa no início do ano e que teima em manter-se o centro das atenções e que eu não vou dizer o nome para não lhe dar ainda mais destaque. Antes de avançar, eu gostava, contudo, de fazer uma clarificação importante relacionada com o conceito de sustentabilidade. É um conceito que abrange várias componentes, traduzidas na sigla ESG, Environmental, Social and Governance. No contexto da minha intervenção, eu estou, sobretudo, a dirigir-me a uma dessas componentes, mais concretamente à E, do Environmental, e dentro desta, às alterações climáticas, como sendo o mais destacado determinante da sustentabilidade. Soube que sou o único que vou falar em português, so my apologies for those who are following me in English, but I will use the Portuguese language throughout my speech. Eu estruturei a minha intervenção para caber dentro dos cerca de 20 minutos que me foram atribuídos, e isto implicou privilegiar a abrangência sintética em detrimento da profundidade. E sabendo também que a atenção começa a reduzir-se à medida que o discurso, que o tempo de intervenção avança, eu começarei por tentar tornar claro qual é a raiz do problema que enfrentamos quando falamos de sustentabilidade ou de alterações climáticas. E é importante ter muito claro esse conceito, que é um conceito fundacional do problema, porque essa também é uma condição necessária para ajudar a definir quem deve atuar e como para lidar com este problema e como é que deve atuar. E dentro da sequência que eu também estruturei aqui para a minha intervenção, procurarei depois, e igualmente de forma muito sintética, aprofundar um pouco mais aquilo que é o espaço dedicado ao sistema financeiro e também tentarei partilhar alguma informação focada naquilo que tem sido a abordagem do Banco de Portugal a estas temáticas e, se o tempo permitir, concluirei também com algumas ideias ou mensagens-chave que me parecem importante reter. Começando então por aquilo que identifica como a raiz do problema, provavelmente todos já ouviram aquela expressão do tudo é economia. E apesar dessa expressão poder parecer exagerada, uma observação mais atenta, creio que elimina o receio de exagero que houvesse. E o tema que nos traz aqui hoje é também mais uma demonstração que essa expressão não é exagerada. O que a expressão traduz, o tudo é economia, é existir um racional económico por trás de todas as decisões que são tomadas, quer por indivíduos, quer por organizações. E um exemplo muito simples é a escolha entre ficar mais 30 minutos a dormir ou levantar-se e usufruir desse tempo abdicando do sono e, portanto, dar-lhe um sentido prático. E apesar de não parecer, há de facto um racional económico por trás dessa decisão que tem a ver com a avaliação que cada um faz do benefício que retira de 30 minutos a dormir comparativamente com o benefício que retira desses mesmos 30 minutos se estiver acordado e ativo, ou seja, aquilo que os economistas chamam o custo de oportunidade. E uma decisão simples como esta terá provavelmente impacto apenas no decisor, não tendo por isso consequências para aqueles que o rodeiam. Não tem também aquilo que os economistas chamam externalidades. E se as tiver, elas são seguramente negligenciáveis. No extremo oposto da relevância económica e por causa também das externalidades que incorpora e também do custo de oportunidade que representa, está o tema que nós temos hoje aqui para abordar. Na origem do problema da sustentabilidade e da necessidade imperiosa de ser enfrentado está muito provavelmente o maior fenómeno de mispricing que existe à escala planetária e do qual há memória. E isto porque as externalidades negativas, que são decorrentes dos impactos ambientais de diferentes atividades, não têm sido, nem estão a ser, corretamente incorporadas nos preços dos produtos e dos serviços que são pelos diferentes agentes económicos. Sejam os que executam essas atividades, sejam os que as incorporam como produtos ou serviços intermédios, sejam também aqueles que atuam como consumidores finais, ou também aqueles que financiam essas atividades. E se nós acreditarmos que este é o principal problema, e esse é um pressuposto importante, então a solução tem que passar forçosamente pelo ajustamento dos preços relativos entre produtos e serviços que têm uma externalidade negativa e aqueles que não têm essa externalidade. E isso significa encarecer uns em detrimento de outros, e o que é claramente uma matéria que cai sobretudo dentro das competências de quem faz escolhas de política económica e de política fiscal. Mas isso não significa que este caminho que se quer fazer de ajustamento dos preços de produtos e de serviços, neste caminho não exista também um papel muito importante para o setor financeiro, incluindo supervisores e também reguladores. Isto leva-me ao ponto seguinte da minha intervenção, que é entrar no porquê é que este tema é relevante para o sistema financeiro e, enfim, para os bancos centrais e supervisores em geral. Eu vou procurar aqui assinalar 3 dimensões que tornam este tema particularmente relevante para o sistema financeiro e para os bancos centrais e para os supervisores. A primeira dimensão é a dimensão da estabilidade financeira. É algo que está intimamente ligado aos mandatos dos bancos centrais e que tem implicações para todo o sistema financeiro e também para o setor não financeiro. E é neste ponto que eu me irei deter um pouco mais à frente. A segunda dimensão tem a ver com a política monetária. A política monetária é uma responsabilidade dos bancos centrais, tem implicações poderosíssimas para a generalidade dos agentes económicos e, por isso, tudo aquilo que possa impactar o seu correto funcionamento suscita sempre também uma enorme atenção por parte dos bancos centrais. A terceira dimensão é a dimensão estratégica e que tem vindo a ser atribuída ao tema da sustentabilidade por parte de um número crescente de membros da comunidade de bancos centrais, acompanhando de alguma forma aquilo que também tem sido a tendência que se tem verificado no setor empresarial. Entrando na primeira dimensão que referi, aquela onde eu aprofundarei um pouco mais, nós temos de facto vindo a assistir a uma evolução crescente quer da visibilidade, quer da previsibilidade, no sentido de que são cada vez mais esperados os efeitos dos riscos que são associados às alterações climáticas. Estes riscos são geralmente classificados em 2 grandes categorias. Por um lado, os riscos físicos, que estão relacionados com a maior frequência e intensidade das catástrofes naturais, das secas, das cheias, os fogos, furacões, por aí fora, e também com as consequências da degradação ambiental, da poluição, da acidificação dos oceanos, da subida de temperatura, redução da biodiversidade, etc. E temos também o outro grupo, os riscos de transição, que estão relacionados com aquilo que é incontornável, a necessidade de ajustamento a um sistema económico e uma sociedade mais verde, como resultado também das alterações regulamentares ou fiscais, da evolução tecnológica, das alterações das preferências dos consumidores ou até mesmo daquilo que tem sido, que é o aumento da própria litigância jurídica que se já vai verificando. Quantificar estes impactos, determinando um horizonte temporal em que eles se produzirão e também o cálculo dos custos que estão associados, tudo isto está ainda rodeado de uma enorme incerteza. Mas apesar dessa incerteza, uma coisa é certa, são muito poucos aqueles que questionam que as alterações climáticas produzem, de facto, efeitos que são não lineares, que são muitas vezes irreversíveis, que atravessam as fronteiras nacionais e que têm também uma fatura muito elevada em termos de custos para todos. E é também reconhecido que estes custos são assimétricos entre países, entre regiões e até entre setores de atividade dentro do mesmo país, porque quer a magnitude, quer a forma como se distribuem os impactos, acabam por depender de vários fatores, entre os quais podem constar, por exemplo, o grau de exposição ao risco ambiental e o nível de resiliência de um país, de uma região, de um setor, ou até mesmo de uma empresa em concreto. Também as próprias medidas de mitigação que são tomadas ou que venham a ser tomadas pelas autoridades competentes e o timing em que o fazem. E um exemplo, por exemplo, a cidade de Tóquio, que construiu todo um sistema de galerias e de aquedutos para lidar com o tema das inundações e, portanto, proteger-se, é uma forma de mitigar esse risco. E há também a própria reação dos agentes económicos. Da conjugação de tudo isto que eu acabei de referir, pode-se concluir, de facto, que o fenómeno das alterações climáticas releva para o sistema financeiro em dois planos fundamentais. Por um lado, os riscos ambientais são fonte de risco financeiro, na medida em que quer os riscos físicos, quer os riscos de transição, eles tendem a repercutir-se na disponibilidade dos ativos e também na valorização dos ativos que são financiados ou que são usados como colateral pelo sistema financeiro. E estes riscos têm, por isso, que ser devidamente refletidos nas modalidades e no preço das operações de financiamento. Nós temos ouvido frequentemente sugestões no sentido de subsidiar o que é verde, mas a posição que o banco tem defendido é claramente no sentido que o preço de financiamento reflita adequadamente o risco que está associado. Por outro lado, também a transição para uma economia mais verde implica um volume muito substancial de investimento ao longo de várias décadas, investimento esse que, enfim, não podendo ser feito por geração espontânea, ele vai ter que ser financiado. Para se cumprir o objetivo que a União Europeia definiu, no sentido de em 2050 se atingir a neutralidade carbónica em termos líquidos, as estimativas apontam para até 290 mil milhões de euros de necessidades de investimento por ano. Isto equivale a cerca de 2% do PIB da União Europeia. Se nós pensarmos nos constrangimentos que temos ao nível da poupança, isto falando de Portugal, do endividamento, da apetência por risco, não é difícil imaginar o quanto este tema é de particular relevância para um país como Portugal e também para o seu sistema financeiro. Assegurar os montantes de investimento que vão ser necessários para este objetivo de atingir a neutralidade carbónica implica, por isso, pelo menos três condições. Uma combinação de investimento público e privado, uma combinação de financiamento tradicional com outras modalidades, equity, quase capital, capital de risco, e também que o sistema financeiro, no seu todo, desempenhe adequadamente o seu papel na canalização de fluxos financeiros para o chamado investimento verde, e não basta ser pintado de verde, ele tem que ser intrinsecamente verde. E, portanto, não é difícil perceber a enorme oportunidade de negócio que este aumento da procura por financiamento representa para o sistema financeiro. Mas é uma oportunidade que tem também desafios de magnitude equivalente ou até maior. Por um lado, trata-se de financiar investimentos que têm um potencial muito significativo de aceleração do progresso tecnológico e de criação de valor, mas, por outro lado, o cálculo do prémio de risco e a adequação dos instrumentos de financiamento a este tipo de investimento são desafios também que os operadores financeiros não podem ignorar. As instituições financeiras que, no seu balanço, ficam com o risco da aplicação dos recursos que são postos à sua disposição pelos aforradores, elas têm que assegurar que o preço que cobram pelas operações de financiamento reflete adequadamente o grau de sustentabilidade do ativo que está subjacente a esse investimento. Um cálculo de rendibilidade que não tenha em conta o risco ambiental naquilo que for o horizonte temporal relevante para a aplicação dos recursos, tenderá quase inevitavelmente a subestimar também a viabilidade do investimento. Portanto, assegurar que o risco é devidamente avaliado, quer para evitar a sua acumulação excessiva, quer para assegurar níveis adequados de capital, aquilo que se designa normalmente buffers, para poder garantir resiliência caso o risco se materialize, é uma preocupação que está diretamente ligada a um dos principais mandatos dos bancos centrais e das autoridades de supervisão, que é o da preservação da estabilidade financeira. E aqui sublinho que preservar a estabilidade financeira não é impedir que existam falências ou perdas. É, isso sim, assegurar que, caso existam, porque é normal que elas existam, podem ser absorvidas sem pôr em causa o funcionamento do sistema no setor. Mas como, enfim, em muitas situações, também neste caso é muito mais fácil dizer do que fazer, porque há muitos obstáculos a ultrapassar para viabilizar e incentivar na prática esta internalização dos custos da sustentabilidade ambiental no cálculo financeiro. E esses obstáculos podem ser agrupados em duas grandes categorias. Uma resulta da ausência, ao nível das empresas, de informação granular, que seja fiável, que seja comparável e que permita construir benchmarks e classificar a natureza e o risco dos investimentos. Há progressos neste domínio, felizmente. A divulgação, em meados de 2017, das recomendações da Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures e, mais recentemente, também a adoção do Regulamento Europeu para a promoção do investimento sustentável, também conhecido pelo Regulamento da Taxonomia. Este regulamento foi aprovado em junho, deve estar operacional, espera-se, em 2022 e estabelece um conjunto de critérios que permitirão determinar se uma atividade económica é sustentável do ponto de vista ambiental, permitindo, por essa via, aferir o grau de sustentabilidade de um dado investimento. O segundo desafio decorre da própria natureza dos projetos de investimento sustentável. Estes projetos, que envolvem frequentemente tecnologias e modelos de governo que são inovadores, têm custos significativos em investigação e desenvolvimento, incorporam uma elevada intensidade capitalística, apresentam risco elevado, têm horizontes de concretização muito longos, 10, 20, 30 ou até mais anos. Portanto, tudo isto adensa a complexidade. E por tudo isto, muitos projetos exigem instrumentos de financiamento complementares àquilo que são os tradicionais instrumentos de dívida. E refiro-me, enfim, já o disse atrás, instrumentos de capital, quasi capital, capital de risco ou venture capital. Isso não impede, naturalmente, que exista espaço para desenvolver também os instrumentos de mercados de dívida. A título de exemplo, na semana passada tive um encontro no Eurofi e, para além daquilo que se ouve muito falar, dos green bonds, também se estava a falar dos transition bonds, portanto, um instrumento de dívida adaptado também para dar flexibilidade nos instrumentos para os desafios que estão pela frente do sistema financeiro e dos agentes económicos. A segunda dimensão, portanto, falei na dimensão da estabilidade financeira, é da política monetária, enfim, para benefício aqui do cumprimento do limite de tempo da minha intervenção, aqui serei muito telegráfico. Para além da preservação da estabilidade financeira que eu já referi, há de facto uma outra componente que está integrada na generalidade dos mandatos dos bancos centrais e que pode ser particularmente impactada quer pelas alterações climáticas, quer pelas medidas de mitigação. E, de facto, essa outra área é a da política monetária. E aqui, como referi que seria telegráfico, o que eu gostava apenas de assinalar é que o ponto de contacto da sustentabilidade com a política monetária está diretamente relacionado com o facto de as alterações climáticas e as políticas de mitigação e de adaptação que estão associadas podem impactar fortemente na oferta e na procura. E esse impacto na oferta e na procura é suscetível de influenciar um elemento importante, que é a chamada taxa de juros neutra e o próprio mecanismo de transmissão monetária, afetando, por essa via, a própria condução da política monetária. E face à importância da política monetária, que creio que tem sido bem visível para todos, nenhum Banco Central pode negligenciar qualquer aspecto que possa impactar o funcionamento dessa mesma política. A terceira dimensão, e última, queria referir, a dimensão estratégica, enfim, também de forma telegráfica, e prende-se com o facto dos bancos centrais e dos supervisores, para além de dois aspectos que eu já referi, que está ligado ao seu mandato e, portanto, que os leva a olhar para este tema da sustentabilidade de forma crescente e particularmente empenhada, como é o caso da preservação da estabilidade e da implementação da política monetária, estão também a seguir o caminho de outras entidades do setor financeiro, e não só, no sentido de incorporarem nos seus planos estratégicos e na sua gestão corrente uma atenção crescente aos parâmetros ESG, portanto, o Environmental, Social and Corporate Governance. Ou seja, enquanto organizações, elas próprias, com impacto no ambiente, querem fazer a sua parte, dar o seu contributo e, por essa via, também dar o exemplo. E o caráter transversal e supranacional destas preocupações, eles acabaram por ter estado na origem da criação, em dezembro de 2007, da NGFS, a Network of Central Banks and Supervisors for Greening the Financial System, que visa, entre outras coisas, promover boas práticas de gestão dos riscos ambientais do setor financeiro e também apoiar a transição para uma economia mais sustentável. Esta network conta atualmente com 69 membros, com 13 observadores, todo o mundo, incluindo, enfim, parece já as Nações Unidas dos bancos centrais e dos supervisores, incluindo também o Banco de Portugal, que aderiu em 2018. E eu aqui gostava só de sublinhar, também telegraficamente, que tendo estado, na minha vida anterior, ligado ao mundo empresarial, onde a competição é a palavra-chave, é de facto um privilégio constatar que a comunidade dos bancos centrais e dos supervisores tem uma notável capacidade de partilhar informação e de cooperar de forma muito aberta e empenhada. Isto leva-me ao último ponto que queria partilhar convosco, antes de concluir, é que tem que ver com entrar um pouco mais especificamente naquilo que o Banco de Portugal tem vindo a fazer. O Banco não podia, naturalmente, ficar alheio àquilo que são as preocupações relacionadas com a sustentabilidade e, por isso, em março deste ano, divulgou o compromisso do Banco de Portugal para a sustentabilidade e o financiamento sustentável, traduzido nesta pequena brochura, que está disponível também online, se quiserem consultar. Este documento enquadra a resposta do banco aos desafios da sustentabilidade, em particular àqueles que são suscitados pelas alterações climáticas, e define 4 eixos de atuação: a identificação, o primeiro eixo, a identificação e a avaliação dos riscos associados ao impacto das alterações climáticas, a adoção de práticas internas de sustentabilidade, o segundo eixo, a participação em instâncias internacionais e nacionais e, por fim, também o quarto eixo, a comunicação e a colaboração com outras entidades. Eu detalhando um pouco mais aqui também cada um destes eixos, no primeiro eixo, o banco integrou na agenda de estudos a avaliação, a identificação e a avaliação dos riscos que estão associados às alterações climáticas. E estão em curso vários trabalhos de investigação. Eu destacaria aqui 2 estudos que estão em fase de elaboração e que esperamos divulgar logo que seja oportuno. Um primeiro estudo que procura avaliar aquilo que são as exposições do sistema bancário português a sociedades não financeiras em setores que são relevantes na perspectiva das alterações climáticas e aqui tendo como objetivo identificar as vulnerabilidades do setor bancário à transição para uma economia de baixo carbono. Nós consideramos fundamental conhecer e bem quais são os riscos que já estão hoje nos balanços das instituições financeiras por via da exposição que têm aos setores mais impactados para a transição energética. Um segundo estudo tem que ver com aspectos geofísicos e tecnológicos e económicos das alterações climáticas e também das políticas económicas que são destinadas a mitigar os efeitos das alterações climáticas. E esperamos que estes estudos, de facto, contribuam para boas decisões baseadas em conhecimento concreto. O nosso segundo eixo de atuação é a implementação de práticas internas de sustentabilidade, nomeadamente na gestão de carteira de ativos do banco e também na redução da pegada ecológica do banco enquanto organização. Há cerca de um ano, o banco integrou os princípios ESG naquilo que são as normas orientadoras para a gestão de ativos, de investimento próprios do banco e estão também em curso atualmente outros trabalhos para implementação de um novo normativo. Enfim, dada a dimensão do balanço do banco, percebe-se a importância que estas orientações podem ter na alocação de recursos da carteira de investimento. No final deste ano, o banco também aderiu ao Compromisso Lisboa Capital Verde 2020, uma iniciativa da Câmara de Lisboa. Comprometemos com um conjunto de 10 ações a implementar em áreas-chave. Já neste mês também assinámos um acordo de parceria com a Agência Portuguesa do Ambiente, Direção-Geral da Administração do Território, Faculdade de Ciências da Universidade de Lisboa e o Instituto Português do Mar e da Atmosfera, com o propósito também de elaborar um roadmap para a adaptação de Portugal às alterações climáticas no século XXI. O terceiro eixo de atuação refere-se à intervenção em instâncias nacionais e internacionais, onde são debatidas medidas que têm impacto no sistema financeiro. Esta é uma área na qual muito se tem passado e em muitos palcos. No plano internacional, o Banco de Portugal integra atualmente 12 grupos de trabalho que estão repartidos por entidades como o BCE, como a EBA, o Comitê Europeu de Riscos Sistémicos, o BIS e a própria NGFS. E o nosso conceito de integrar grupos de trabalho não é apenas o de estar lá para ouvir o que os outros dizem, mas embora isso também seja importante, mas é estar para participar. Nós vivemos num contexto em que cada vez mais as regras pelas quais nós nos regemos são estabelecidas a nível europeu e não a nível nacional. E temos que ter capacidade de acompanhar e tentar influenciar tudo aquilo que nos pode impactar pela via regulatória que é definida supranacionalmente. Aquilo que já várias vezes tenho dito, que nós podemos não ter o argumento da força, mas devemos e podemos ter a força dos argumentos. Também no plano nacional, o Banco participa no Grupo de Reflexão para o Financiamento Sustentável, um grupo que funciona coordenado pelo Ministério do Ambiente e da Ação Climática e que integra outros supervisores financeiros e também associações do setor e outras entidades. Finalmente, no quarto e último eixo de atuação, que é o da comunicação e da colaboração com entidades externas, enfim, que abrange aqui o estabelecimento de contactos, trabalho em rede. Neste domínio, o Banco tem participado em várias conferências, seminários, tem publicado artigos em revistas especializadas e tido uma colaboração muito ativa com os mídias. Em suma, e para terminar, eu gostava de realçar 4 ideias-chave muito telegraficamente. A preocupação com a sustentabilidade, e em particular na sua vertente ambiental, encerra desafios muito complexos, mas também enormes oportunidades que o sistema financeiro não pode ignorar. O risco ambiental e a transição para um patamar superior de sustentabilidade são fonte de risco financeiro, têm implicações estruturais quer na oferta, quer na procura, e isso coloca este tema no centro das atenções dos bancos centrais e dos supervisores financeiros, pelas implicações que têm em 2 áreas que são cruciais nos seus mandatos: a estabilidade financeira e a implementação da política monetária. O financiamento sustentável é condição necessária para o sucesso da transição para uma economia e uma sociedade mais verdes, mas não substitui a necessidade de uma política ambiental abrangente e coerente por parte do Poder Executivo, enquanto responsável pelas opções de política económica e fiscal. Os agentes económicos são racionais, precisam sobretudo dos incentivos e também dos desincentivos certos para alinharem os seus comportamentos com a maximização da utilidade para a sociedade, e conseguir esse alinhamento cabe sobretudo na esfera da atuação da política económica e fiscal. Eu termino agradecendo mais uma vez à PSO o convite para estar aqui hoje, formulando os votos de uma excelente e proveitosa manhã de trabalho e sugerindo uma imagem que eu gostaria que fosse inspiradora para muitas e importantes decisões que nós temos pela frente. E a boa notícia é que nós não precisamos passar fronteiras, enfim, estar sujeitos à quarentena, para ver essa imagem e obter essa inspiração. Basta ir aqui próximo de nós, ao INE, o Instituto Nacional de Estatística, e ler o que está escrito no vitral da autoria de um artista, também ele português, Abel Manta. Enfim, a frase que está lá em latim, eu não vou dizer em latim porque o meu conhecimento de latim não aconselha que eu diga, mas traduzido para português quer dizer no conhecimento dos números, a prosperidade. Eu acho que isto é uma frase inspiradora e deve nortear muito daquilo que temos para frente. Muito obrigado a todos mais uma vez. Bom dia.
On sustainable finance matters at FinExtra. And he will kick off with a keynote presentation focused on how financial systems are operating and will need to operate in the age of sustainable finance. Richard will be followed by Mario Carmo. Mario will not only share his experience as head of governance, risk and compliance at ASICO PST, but will also summarize the wealth of information that Richard will share with us and how that will be even more relevant in the Portuguese context. Thank you.
Tive que ir a mata-cavalos, João Paulo. Tive que ir a mata-cavalos.
Daí o microfone de irmão. Richard?
Are you able to share my slides as it's been disabled on my end? Or if you could just reduce the disabling so I can share them. Or shall I just continue without slides?
Yes, please do.
Certainly. Well, thank you. It's a privilege to be speaking with you today. My name is Richard Peers, and I work for Responsible Risk. I was at Microsoft for 23 years in our financial services strategy team, and I'm also contributing editor at Finextra, which on sustainable finance. What I was asked to do today was to really try and talk to you a little bit about where we are and why we are focusing on sustainable finance. And obviously, we've just had that explained very eloquently to us by Mr. De Souza. For those that are not speaking Portuguese, then I will briefly really do a very brief overview of some of the points that have driven us to why sustainable finance is focused today. But really what I want to move on to is where we are before getting to where we need to be. And it is this future piece that I actually want to put the majority of my focus onto. So if we look back to about 2018, really one of the sort of the major movements, which I think is the basis of what we're hearing from the central bank, is that the Financial Stability Board of the banks all realized quite clearly that there was going to be an impact on the banking system itself. So looking at what would be the shocks of climate change in particular, this has obviously evolved into things like natural ecosystems as well, but on the assets that are held within those financial institutions. And then essentially looking at that carbon, the impacts around flooding and so forth that we're all familiar with, and the transition risks associated with trying to move from a carbon economy to a decarbonized economy. What would that mean to people and banks and investors in terms of the value of their assets? Would they become sunk or trapped assets? And what would be the shock to the financial system? So as a result of that, and the TCFD, which we heard mentioned just now, the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosure, there was really a clear sense from financial institutions that the stewards of trillions of dollars of corporate finance really had to get a grip on what was, if you will, their brown assets, to keep it very simple, and their green assets, to understand what that was, to talk about to understand the externalities, which we heard referenced in the previous speech, and price this into the system so that at least we knew what the baseline was and what the shock would be. And we knew that reporting, transparency, to do that would have to be improved. So essentially, it's recognition, the impact on the financial system, and subsequently, obviously, the need to start to look beyond financial reporting to non-financial reporting, to include areas such as E, S, and G, but to really move to fundamentally impact investing was the driver to what got us going, and all the initiatives that were just spoken about. Now, if we look at sustainable finance, it's a complex area, and it's really important for us to understand the different layers within this. If we look at traditional finance, then essentially we're talking about no consideration, particularly of any significant negative incomes for people and the planet. The focus is just on profit. If we look at what is sometimes called responsible investing, we're trying to avoid harm. So this is where we focus on exclusions, and people perhaps are familiar with exclusionary areas such as tobacco and arms and so forth. Where we move into sustainable investing is where we're talking about having a beneficial or effect, a positive outcome for people and planet, and moving to a stakeholder economy, as we've heard from people like the Business Round Table. But ultimately, moving forward, we really want to move to more impact-driven, where we're not just recalibrating existing activity and assessing it, which is important as part of the transition pathway initiatives, but investment is specifically targeting outcomes that are going to be measurable and are going to improve people, profit, and planet. Now, I mentioned profit in that last phrase because historically a lot of this has been perceived to be values-based activity, but at the risk of value. And as we heard, I think previously, and many of you will have read, that certainly in the last few quarters, the amount of funds flowing into ESG and impact level investments has grown very significantly. And over time, actually, if you look back, you'll see that the organizations such as Triodos Bank and the GABV set of banks that focus on values have actually often outperformed their traditional counterparts. So this is about values and value. But as we move through, obviously we're talking through a spectrum of risk, as we always do in the world of financial services. And we're talking about a world of assessment and measurement. And this is really where I want to move on to. Because when we look at it, we have at the moment something like $47 trillion of capital, according to the UN, according to the Climate Action 100 lists, which has been pledged and allocated to impact investing, to sustainable finance, $47 trillion of capital. But the amount of that has actually been invested in projects which hit those criteria I've just been talking to is really very small. And we talk about this in the sense of if you like, a huge dam of reservoir of capital, which is held back behind a huge wall. And that is only trickling down into the actual initiatives that are genuinely going to reduce CO2 or address the UN SDGs, as we have heard about from the previous speaker. And this huge wall of capital is held back as many things, which are very serious issues, are being addressed by many people, such as the data challenges, or of how do you analyze non-financial data and get it into an organization's risk assessment capability. What about the schemas for this? What about the taxonomies? Which reporting standard do we use? And many of these different factors have held back people investing because of the fear of being perhaps a reputational risk, which if they invest in the wrong thing that turns out to have a negative impact will actually adversely affect their organization. And obviously banks very much are based on trust. That trust has been damaged over time. As it's been rebuilt, then obviously very much people want to protect that very carefully. So where are we now? If that's what's been our incentive to get on this path and what it is, where are we now? Well, the TCFD from the FSB came out in 2018, and it gave a 5-year time frame from 2018. And if you look at it loosely on the map, we can share this in the slides, subsequently. We spoke about a greater adoption, further development of information provided, metrics and scenario analysis, and greater maturity in using information. And I think that's where we are right now. We've obviously seen the EU taxonomy being passed into law. We're seeing the technical group actually working on the EU taxonomy and making that available. But these are all, very important, but just at the beginning of the journey. But of course, we all know when you look at anything, whether it's digital transformation, these are 10-year cycles quite often at the very least. And this is indeed much more complicated, much more multi-layered transition than just a digital transformation that we will have heard about in the fourth industrial revolution. So we need to move a lot faster, given the climate crisis that we have, than the normal modus operandi of delivering the data so that we can make this capital flow. And if we want to get to a point where we have a broad understanding of carbon-related assets, the risk associated in investments in new long-term projects, we're going to have to change our game a little bit. So where I would say, just in midpoint summary, I would say that where we've been is we really haven't had the data. We've had the data, but we've not calculated and used it in our risk assessments of our assets, our capital, and our investments. We've identified that, and we now have a lot of good work going on. But there is a potential at the moment, from where we stand, for a lot of greenwashing, which is this potential for people to go into work and within a very short period of time say, we've done an ESG assessment on our portfolio or on our fund, and this is now fully classified as ESG and available. The data from the data suppliers that may have informed those decisions has low correlation, as is well known. The source of those data is often just from disclosures. The audit function is not necessarily caught up with this wave that we're going through. And so people are marking their own homework, and the people that are checking the homework are not finding a correlation between their analysis. So really where we need to get to is we need to get to a future-looking world where we can see a predictive analysis of what is going on. We need to get the data in real time, not in a historical batch process. And we need to be able to analyze it at much greater speed and transparency with real confidence that we know where that data has originated from. And that is a tall order, but it's really where we need to be aiming for. So in front of me, I have a beautifully complex chart, which I'm going to try and explain to you verbally. But essentially, we need to move, excuse me, to a world where we have what we call a planetary computer, or a digital twin of the computer. We need to be able to think of this circular economy where essentially we can think of every field, every river, every fish in the ocean almost, where we can track and trace where it is, what is happening to it, and as it moves through the supply chain, what is actually happening to that. And let me perhaps tell you a story in absence of the slide. We showed at a workshop a project from Ocean Mind. Ocean Mind are able, using satellites and sensors, to track the oceans, the fisheries fleets of the oceans as they go out to sea. They're able to see where these fleets are going. They're able to see if they've been swapping, things like the SIMs, which they have to track them. They can use machine learning and artificial intelligence to do this gap analysis. When these fleets return to shore, they can see if they've landed, what is happening in comparison to their peers. They can also check on things like slavery. They can see if a small boat has been at sea for far too long for working practices, dropping off its fish to a larger trawler, and therefore potential for slavery happening on that fishing fleet. So as this data comes in, they can also direct the fishery protection fleets out to targeted locations where they see perhaps illegal fishing happening. And this sort of analysis, forward-looking, real-time analysis of data, which can come through the supply chain, so that as it's validated, perhaps using technologies such as blockchain, we can see as a financial system that we can certificate that that supply chain, that asset set, and we can lend to those organizations and bring them onto our asset book, knowing that we are truly greening the financial system based on excellent provenance of data, which is being delivered from the material world. And hopefully with natural capital accounting and other methods, we will be able to bring in the view of these externalities that we've not seen before. If I leave you one last thought, As we look at climate as one factor, we know that it's actually Earth systems are indeed hugely complicated. Just look at California at the moment. We're hearing about obviously long periods of drought, which have created obviously the tinder effect in the forest. This has happened because obviously there's been a lot less rainfall, but also you have the wind systems that are building up and using the natural topology of the geography to drive these huge infernos of hot air, which encourage the fire. These things have been predicted for 30 years or so by different organizations. And our organizations have indeed taken risks into account, mitigating or adaptations into their policy. Those asset bases that have taken this forward-looking, predictive, real-time approach were able to avoid some of the worst effects of fire by creating these mitigations. The companies, the financial institutions that are able to work on the ground with those sort of organizations will obviously have much more reliable assets in their portfolios. So this whole world has got to move into an interconnected circular economy based on real-time data, and it is that which I think has got to be accelerated rapidly if we want to make sustainable finance truly a deliverable for our planet. Thank you very much.
Good to be here. I'm here representing an IT company that is specialized in the banking industry. So sustainable finance is quite a challenge because it's challenging the entire financial system. And we as IT providers and consultant providers are also part of that challenge. So I'm going to share with you some of the highlights of the work that we've been doing in considering what we consider to be the critical issues for sustainable finance. So we feel that we are already going towards this sustainable finance, more on the social part of it, because in compliance, for example, there are a lot of new variables that are already implemented, and anti-money laundering, and all the systems that we now have in place in banks consider other variables. We need to focus on weapons, massive destruction, and all those concepts that may affect the reputational risk of a bank if they are involved, as well as other variables. So, taking this into consideration, let's go back to data. What are the challenges that we are facing today in Portugal? We are prepared to have structured data in the banks. We are not quite well prepared to have unstructured data. This is one of the challenges, and as Richard shared with us, now there's a lot of new information that we need, and most of that data is unstructured. Unstructured data is not a data that you simply have classified, well organized in the systems. It's just a lot of data that are coming. It can be from the media, social networks, from the other IT companies that I'll talk about in the integration, that are gathering lots and lots of information, millions of data. And having that information, even if a bank has that information, it needs to be available. So we are putting a big effort, and all the banks are doing a big effort to have that information available, well structured, so you can then measure the risk correctly. So if we don't understand the data, we cannot measure that data. And then there's always data quality. Even if we have that information, even if is it good? Is it the data that we need to face? These are practical issues that banks are facing, and we as an IT company providing banks, we also face these challenges, and this is what we are addressing on the data part. Integration, the other main issue. I think here we are having now a big challenge. When we talk of integration, external integration with the banks, it comes up my mind, open banking, PSD2. This is what is now well known. But for many, many years, banks have been integrating with other systems, central banks, payment systems, rating agencies. Banks are already connected to other institutions. So this is not new. What we see, and we notice that it needs to be, we need to adopt new integrations. And here comes the fintechs, buzzword, fintechs, and where can we transform this information that fintechs is already gathering, as Richard gave some examples, IoT. A bank is not properly prepared to use the information from satellites into the risk analysis. So we see here an opportunity now, and not a threat, for banks to cooperate and for us to integrate with fintechs that already have that information. They're already understanding that information. They are measuring, they are classifying that information, and now it can be shared in an already structured way so that banks can incorporate either the final result or, as a rating agency, they can just use part of that information into their own models. This is the practical way and the use cases that we are working with banks, and it goes toward the sustainable finance that we see, because we now have computer processing that we've never had before. We have new algorithms, and we have all types of technology that will now support bank, but obviously, as we've seen, the entire governance and the mind needs to be now focused on sustainable finance for the good of all of us. So, thank you.
So thank you, Richard, for your excellent remarks, and Mario for the paper discussion you just shared with all of us. I would now like to pass it over to Miguel Martins, founding partner at Renew and sustainable investment partner at Grosvenor House of Investments, and who will be the moderator for the next two panels. Welcome.
PSO for inviting me to be here. Thank you also to the very small group of people we have in the room, mostly panelists that joined us here this morning. And thank you to all of you over there, I think it's one of those cameras, for joining us virtually here today. The challenges that we are currently facing as a species are unprecedented and totally extraordinary. Development has reached a scale where it's actually affecting vital planetary processes. Most of you have heard about the new formulations of economies, of what economics should look like, donut economies or donut economics, planetary boundaries. So that's where we are. We are right there. And what that means is that the degrees of freedom for the human sustainable exploitation of this planet are severely constrained. So we really have, one of them is to be a pessimist, right? So when you are a pessimist, it's all about denial. Mostly in the political sphere, we have a growing number of deniers in chief that keep telling us that, you know, it's going to get better, it's going to get cooler, it's going to get this and that, and it's not unless we do something. So what we've noticed in the sustainability path towards a more sustainable world is that the most pernicious barrier that we have faced has been denial. That has made us really constrained in terms of dealing with sustainability issues of our age. And the other human, because as humans, we are very capable of blocking all sorts of trauma in that hope that maybe, just maybe, it will get better. In this case, if we don't take action, it's not going to get better. So if we want to take this denial approach, we can, but we need to be aware that we need to be very conscious that the prospects of things going wrong is very real. If we don't do anything, things will go wrong. And there's no doubt about that, unless we don't want to look at science. Then we can be an optimist, right? And I for those who know me, I like to say this over and over again, it is too late to be a pessimist. We need to be optimists. We need to focus, as Luis mentioned when he opened the conference, we need to focus on the economic opportunity. And if we are out of ideas, there's this 17 guys here, the SDGs. If we look at the SDGs alone, we are talking about per year between 2.5 to 3 trillion dollars of economic opportunity. So if we don't have any ideas on how to turn all this immense crisis that we are going through into economic opportunity, we have this framework from the United Nations. Okay? So what I'm going to do now, this is not about me. What I'm going to do now is we are going to have two panels that I'm pleased to moderate. The first panel will focus on the experiences from abroad, even though we are going to have two panelists that are actually based in Portugal. But in particular case of Luis, even though he's based in Portugal and CEO of BBVA Portugal, is also going to share with us some of the experiences that BBVA has outside, particularly in Latin America. And then the second panel will focus on Portugal, on the models that we have, and how we can replicate and take to scale some of the things that we are discussing in the first panel and that we are seeing out there. So for the first panel, we are going to have two friends in the room and two joining us virtually. And I'm going to go through them in alphabetical order. I have the bios, but the trick here was we have 45 minutes. If I focus on the bios, we're going to be losing precious time. So the bios are going to be available online. I'm just going to say your names and the institutions you represent and your titles. So first place we have José Manuel Campa, and he's the chairperson for the European Banking Authority. Then we have Luis Castro Almeida, CEO of BBVA Portugal. My namesake, Miguel Valente, Securities Market Liaison Representative for Altri. And we are going to invite Richard Pearce back, and as you know, is the Responsible Risk, he is the founder of Responsible Risk, but also the editor for Sustainable Finance Issues at Finastra. So for the two, Luis and Miguel, if you could join us here. Again, for those who know me, you know that sometimes I tend to be politically incorrect, and I'm going to do that now. We are talking about sustainability. We have talked already about the E of ESG, environment, not so much about the S. We'll go to that later today. But, I just wanted to place it out there because most of you will be noticing that. The S of social in sustainability is also about diversity, and in the conference circuit theme, what we have here today, it's a panel. Lingo for a panel just with dudes. So this is something that we need to improve on the next one. So I'm going to bring this here, and I would like, do we have José Manuel? I would like to start with him.
Yes, can you hear
So
me?
we talked about challenges, and one of the big challenges that we are facing right now has to do with COVID-19. COVID is clearly the most challenging crisis that we have faced since World War II. We know it's going to plunge the global economy into the worst recession since then, and in this not to mention the human tragedy that is already developing before our eyes. But looming behind this crisis, we also have to deal with other challenges, and climate change is clearly one of them. So, Jose, kicking off the panel with you, I would like to ask you two interrelated questions. First of all, welcome. Would like to ask you two interrelated questions. This is the time for leadership. The quality of some of the leaders we have been seeing out there, it's questionable. Can Europe be the strong leader that the world needs, specifically when it comes to sustainability and climate? And will the COVID-19 crisis accelerate sustainable finance, or will it send it to the back burner a little bit like the financial crisis of 2008 did?
Yeah. Thank you. First of all, good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, okay, great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to be in this panel, which I consider to be a very, very important topic, and congratulations on organizing it. Miguel, you asked me two questions, and I'll be very happy to try to address those directly. I think, first of all, issue of leadership. But before I go into the issue of leadership, I think that the COVID crisis, as you say, has ESG originally started being, from the pragmatic point of view and the application point of view, an issue mainly of climate change. And the COVID situation has clearly indicated that it's much broader than that, and that we need to go into sustainability and to broader issues of biodiversity and other aspects that need to be enhanced. So I think that the priorities on ESG are now more timely than ever, and I don't think it's going to the back burner, for sure. Coming back to your second question, particularly clearly indicated that it's very high on their agenda and continues to be high on their agenda, and I think it should be that way. Now, on your second point, which is the leadership aspect, I think that that's a very important point, because many of the issues that we're confronted with the ESG agenda, of course, is that they're global issues in nature, and local solutions to global issues, even if it's as large as the European Union contributor to the world economy, it's suboptimal. So I do think here that there is a challenge on leadership. I do think that Europe can take that leadership and is willing to take it, and I think it's going to be able to probably push forward other areas. I want to highlight that it's not alone on this process. I think there are big important parts of the world that are very sensitive to different aspects of the ESG agenda. Just to mention, obviously, a big economy like Japan has a strong emphasis on ESG and climate-related issues, and smaller economies in smaller parts of the world that are heavily affected by changes in sea levels and changes in climate patterns, that put even the countries at risk, are also highly interested in this agenda. So I think that there is a relatively large amount of the world that is interested in this, and where Europe should really play a leadership on this point. I'll come back later as we go forward on a specific application of things that are being done in different parts of Europe. But in response to your two questions, as I say, I think it's more timely than ever, broader than it was before, and Europe can have a strong leadership in this front.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Jose. I would like now to go to Richard's. So Richard, you already shared with us some very important insights on the role of the financial sector and why a strong focus of the second in sustainability is critical. It does boil down to two things, as you mentioned. One of them is trust, and I'm really happy that we are addressing trust in this gathering today. And trust needs to be rebuilt, even more so after the 2008 financial crisis. But it also goes down to metrics. So this, I remember when we talked, so Richard and Mario and I last week, we were talking about data and that forward look to data, like how do you move from data to information to knowledge and wisdom. But you actually mentioned a very pointed question when it comes to data. All of this is very interesting, but all of these models work depending on the quality and the reliability of the origination of data. So how can we ensure that the data that we use to assess these opportunities that eventually result from the SDGs is good, credible, and traceable?
Yeah, it's absolutely the key question. And when I was at Microsoft, we worked on a few big projects to help large financial institutions get a grip on their asset base and determine from the data that they currently have what is green, what is brown, as I mentioned before. But as we got into it, and I worked very closely with some deep data scientists, we were looking at this whole thing about rubbish in, rubbish out. If you don't have a good grip on the data, then you can find that things are distorted. And there's a case that everybody talks about at the moment in the UK, which is related to COVID, where you had an outbreak in a local area. And a lot of that was to do with the garment industry, and a lot of that was to do with working conditions. And as it went through the supply chain, the garmentry feeding a very popular fast fashion organization, that fast fashion organization was actually atop of most ESG lists, because at the headline, their Scope 1 type emissions, they look pretty good, and under their own self-reporting. But as we got into it, you could see all these issues related to, the S, as we highlighted earlier. So really, how do you do it? And it's when I go back to my sort of little story earlier on, which is about traceability. You've got to have sensors and increasingly satellite data, which can fly over or input from huge ranges of scope. To bring in the inputs of that data. But of course, then as it comes in, it's got to be passed securely, safely, with permission, and it's got to be have a chain of origin all the way through it, so that as it reaches the point of decision making, we can know that that quality of that data is very high. All of that can be done, but it has to be done as it feeds into the financial ecosystem. We've got to put as much effort into looking at those chains of custody of data as we would do of a financial asset as it comes into the financial ecosystem.
Thank you, Richard. And you mentioned a while ago natural capital. I believe that as we start incorporating national capital and human capital into the business models going forwards, data becomes even more important, because it's data sets that we have not really dealt with before, right? So, Richard, one follow-up question. I really like when you mentioned digital twins addressing the big tech companies. And in some cases, big tech companies have been demonized by the power that they are amassing. But the follow-up question would be, how can the financial sector leverage this digital twins to better enforce the risk models of the future?
Well, I think the simple way of looking at it is a couple of brief analogies. The way that I talk to some financial services organizations in terms of the way they gather their data, it feels like a sort of marketing database company of the 1980s. They're going around with a goldfish bowl asking for people to put their business cards in, which they're then manually putting into a spreadsheet. And that spreadsheet has been kicking around the office now for 10 years. And but of course, people, since they put their business card in, have changed jobs, got married, and potentially died. Right. So it's an extreme example of what's going on. Really, where the world has moved forward to is that everybody uses LinkedIn. Nobody puts their business card into a goldfish bowl now. And what does LinkedIn do? It asks you, as the individual entity, to put your data into the system. And then there is a transparency of the fact that you can be your relationships, your entity links, your credentials, etc., can all be seen transparently for what they are. And of course, there's bad information in the system, but really crucial information. You're the governor of the Central Bank of Portugal. That is going to be verifiable and called out pretty rapidly. The reason why that becomes super interesting once you're getting that data, and of course the metaphor means the supply chains can be putting their own data into the indexes or into the data systems, is that you can then start to create this graph databases of seeing the signals as they as relationships, as chains, as people move, as salaries rise. If you looked at the LinkedIn graph, there's a lot more information that comes from that than comes from just the fact that people are reporting what their job is. So the banking industry, if it wants to get access to this data, has got to start to use the open banking principles of saying, we've got open doors, we've got APIs, we can ingest data safely and securely, but obviously there has to be a trade of value between the supply chain getting that data and the product they get back from the financial services industry.
Thank you, Richard. So many more questions come to mind, but I eventually want to get into the opportunity side of the sustainability business, but before that, I would like to go back to Jose Manuel, and the question will be, will quality and reliability of data, if paired adequately with disclosure and reporting, be sufficient to make sustainable finance implementable? And if not, how do you think, Jose Manuel, that we can make our lives easier in the implementation of sustainable finance?
Thank you. I mean, I think that the availability and the quality of the data is an input, a necessary input, but it's not a sufficient condition. And I think that from our perspective is a first initial step. You need to be able to make sure that people have information from that data. So there is a common understanding of what the data means, and I think that's important. And we're encouraging in our agenda with banks. We're encouraging banks to start doing disclosure about their different issues, related, for instance, to climate risk, what their portfolios look like, what they see potential risk, how would they classify them, how do they want to see themselves going forward. But I think to make it really implementable, it requires at least two additional aspects. One, previous one, which I think is very important, which is a governance. What we like to say, is tone from the top. It's a clear indication from the top of the organization that these issues are relevant, that these issues need to be taken into account. And of course, as we always said, the things that we don't measure, they don't exist. This is not true, but from the management point of view, it's very important. So I think data comes into play after that initial governance and initial clear guideline goes first. And then the second aspect I'd like to highlight with data also comes, as I said, you go from data to information through some kind of methodology. And you have methodologies for customer relationships, methodologies for risk management, methodologies for any kind of aspect that you want to transform that data into useful implementable information. So for our point of view, we're encouraging banks very much and supervisors, to start working on risk modeling. Of course, we're a regulator that is very concerned on financial stability. So for us, the adequate profiling of risks is very important. So we put a lot of emphasis on risk modeling. So the way we're going through our agenda, as I say, is first, let's work on disclosure. That's very important, and try to get a common taxonomy. And we've been working very aggressively on this, as you know, this taxonomy within the European Union. But beyond the taxonomy, also let's work within the organizations to make sure that it's adequate governance. And there's this tone from the top indicating that this is important. That's the first step. Second step is start thinking about methodologies of how to transform that data into useful information. And as I say, in that context, that implies particularly risk management models, but I understand that this is very important and we're following that very closely for customer relationships and for other aspects of the organization, operational risk and other areas. And then after that, we will have a much more implementable product that we can pursue over time.
Thank you.
I just wanted to add on that, if I could, because I agree with everything that Jose Manuel has said. But one of the key things, again, I'm always talking in analogies, but if you think of, driving a car, you look through the rear view mirror to see where you've been. And a lot of our risk models today are looking in that small mirror where we've been. If you look at a modern car, a Tesla, not only does it suggest you should be looking through the front window, the biggest one, but it puts sensors and radar into your car so that you can see the head of that juggernaut in front of you for an accident that potentially happens before you can even physically see it. And the sensors then will use the risk management system in the car to move you into obviously a safe position. So our risk system today is looking at sort of corporate disclosures which are coming in, historically in our rearview mirror, and we need this forward-looking predictive data to give us the ability to be able to see what's coming much more rapidly and move us into a safe position. So I hope it's a simple metaphor, but I hope it kind of shows the essence of what I was referring to in my presentation.
Yeah. So thank you, Jose Manuel and Richard, for the answer and for the additional comment. I'm going to use, Richard, your image of rear view versus what's facing us, and I'm going to change pace on the conversation, moving more into the opportunity side. One of the things that I've seen a little bit all over the world, it doesn't matter if it is financial sector or productive sector, it doesn't matter if it is a big company or a small company, if it is a developed country or an emerging market, is that sustainability, to be a winning proposition, needs to be a top-down approach. And Jose Manuel mentioned, start at the top. Luis, you are at the top. So can you share with us your sustainability journey as a professional, but if you can also as a person, as an individual?
Well, I'll start with the professional side of. As you know, BBVA Portugal is part of a group, BBVA Group, which was one of the founding signatory of the UN Principles for Sustainability, and immediately after, the group announced a pledge of a 100 billion euros program until 2025 to finance sustainable projects. Until July, around the world, we've granted 40 billion euros already to fight the climate change programs. And I strongly believe that we are going to have to increase this amount, because what we have in the pipeline, not only in Portugal but also around the world, for demanding of financing for sustainable projects, I think that we will need to raise that amount. As far as Portugal is concerned, we immediately embraced it here in Portugal. It's true that, and this is valid for the banks, but is also valid for any corporation. If the top management doesn't believe in something, the company is not going to do it. You need to believe it, but not in the case of sustainability is not only believing. You need to have a passion for it. You need to live it on a daily basis. We were pioneers in Portugal in green financing. We have done the first green commercial paper with Navigator. With Pestana, we did the first green bond in the world, not only in Portugal, in the world, for the hotel sector. In fact, I was smiling with looking at our panel because we led and we were involved in all the issues, in all the green bond issues, except one, Altri. They were distracted, probably. They didn't talk to us, but we are clear leaders of this in Portugal. And this has to do with our commitment. It's our top priority. It's not one of our priorities, it's our top priority. We made a break for 2 months to attack the COVID situation. Our priority was to protect our employees and our clients. Now we are quite comfortable with all the rules that we've set up. So sustainability became once again one of our priorities. And on the personal side, most of the awareness, and we hear it all the time, around sustainable concerns, sustainable financing, has to do a lot with fear, which is important. Either because we are in an emergency, And either we solve this or we leave a problem to our children and to our grandchildren. And we have a team, a professional team, just to talk with our clients about this. We are attacking not the fear side of the question, but the profitability side of the question. There are a lot of sustainable can be profitable. It's not only a cost. We leave the cost side to governments, to regulators. They will focus on the cost. Brown financing needs to be more expensive than green financing. That has to do with cost. But sustainable can be profitable. And we have teams speaking with Portuguese companies and around the world as well, finding how can an investment or a sustainable investment in their company increases their profit. It's not only about cost. So that's how we are addressing the sustainable finance in Portugal and in the group. Of course, sometimes it's cost. What we know, and this is valid for export companies, is all the value chain. It's already in some sectors, but in all sectors in the near future will have to be sustainable. Large corporations or listed companies are already forcing their suppliers to be sustainable because their stakeholders, either shareholders or clients, are demanding it. So companies need to understand that, and I always use this phrase, which is a fear phrase. You are either sustainable or you die. We use it with, we were also pioneers in digital, and we use it in the past, telling some companies, you either become digital or you will die. So that's how we are addressing, and you need to be passionate about this, and you need to have this. Personally, I don't like to talk about my personal life, but I'm going to do an investment in my house to make it efficient. It doesn't need it. It's perfect, the house. It's just not efficient. And I want to make it more efficient, so that's a cost. And being a parent, it's an immediate cost with the long term. I've done the calculations. The revenue will come, I don't know if I'm going to be alive, but it will be for my children, for my daughters. And being a parent, one of my missions at home is to be constantly shouting, turn off the lights. I'm not a shareholder of EDP. So that's my daily personal involvement in this.
Good, good. I mean, I love when we bring passion into the theme because
you need to.
Emotional intelligence is very important. And and you were just shadowing Brundtland's definition of sustainability was, if we cannot leave the world in a better place than we found it, let's at least leave it in the same shape that we found it, and we are far from that. But Luis, you mentioned, I would like to ask you more in detail a number of things, not necessarily in Portugal, but BBVA is a big financial player in Latin America. And you have great success stories in Latin America of how you're leveraging sustainability to create value, because that's what we need. And data will help us to do that, to show that sustainability actually creates value. So in Latin America, you mentioned technology a while ago. In Latin America, you're using technology to further social inclusion in a number of countries. Can you share with us some of those experiences?
Of course. Well, first I'm going to talk about an institution inside the group, which is BBVA Microfinance Foundation. Has been involved in all of this over the past 12 years. So we got a lot of knowledge from what they were doing in Latin America. They've invested over the past 12 years $14.5 billion in programs, in sustainable programs. So they were already working in this area before the bank decided to be one of the sustainable leaders in the world. According to OECD data, in 2019, BBVA Microfinance Foundation contributed with almost $1.5 billion around the world for social, sustainable education programs, all linked to SDG principles. This makes this foundation number one in Latin America and second worldwide, just after Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So we are quite involved in this, and and being a digital leader was very important and extremely important in two areas. First area, education. Being able to provide and give access to education, not only with the physical presence of teachers, but also at a distance, a digital way. We all learned during COVID-19 that digital is possible, having meetings on the screen is possible. We knew that already, and we were using it already a long time ago. So we use a lot of this knowledge in digitalization, providing tools to students to have access, digital access to education as well in Latin America. And the other, and this is a problem, still a problem in Latin America, have access to banking services and to financial services. A lot of people, there are millions of people still in Latin America that don't have access to financial services that are important for them. I'll give you I will tell you a simple story, very recent, and it's public, was quite advertised. When Uber went to Mexico, one of the problems they had were the drivers. Most of the drivers didn't have a bank account. They were not the owners of the car, they were the drivers of the car. Their income was extremely low, and because of that, they didn't have access to a bank account. So they made an agreement with BBVA. It's a typical open banking situation where we set up, using our digital knowledge in Uber platform, an account for the drivers, a banking account for the drivers. So they receive immediately their earnings in minutes. And also, at the same time, giving them not only some financial services, but also non-financial benefits, like reimbursements of all the gasoline they buy, and other non-financial discounts for other non-financial products at the same time. So this was a typical and the most recent example. And in one of the things in the rural areas, this is valid in Portugal, also, certainly in Latin America, you don't have a bank branch, but you have a grocery shop. And that's how we attacked and started to digitalize the population in rural areas. Our ambassador was the owner of the grocery shop. We almost transformed him into a branch, a bank branch, and they are becoming our ambassadors to provide access to financial services to the population.
I want to move to Miguel, but what you shared and those particular stories remind me of another follow-up question. On the opportunity side, do you find it easier developing those products in the emerging markets compared to the developed world, or the so-called developed world, or?
It's easier on both sides. It's not a problem, and sometimes it's much more easier on the developed world than on the developing world. The need is more on the developing world than on the developed world. So we want to focus more on BBVA Microfinance Foundation, and it's pulling the bank into it as well. They put the capital, we put the finance. Yes. Sort of blended finance programs.
Exactly.
We want to attack more the needs than the opportunity. We attack the opportunity in Portugal as a bank with the corporate side. We have announced also some credit lines for individuals to improve their home efficiencies and to buy electric cars. So that's on the opportunity side.
Exactly.
The need, it's more on the developing world.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Luis. So, Miguel, Altri is a eucalyptus pulp production company, right? But in many ways, you're also an energy company. What triggered that journey of yours towards cogeneration and thermal energy?
First of all, I'd like to thank the invitation and thank your kind words. And just to mention...
My provocation. You can't resist
to remind, just a gentle reminder that we do have a strong partnership with...
No, we do.
We are quite active, as you know, in risk management, in interest rates and hedging FX. We do have a bond issuance with you. So we do need to diversify our portfolio.
Good answer.
Going back, who knows, but in the future, who knows. But going back to your question, yes, Altri is basically a pulp producer. We do have basically three units, three mills. Biggest one is Selby, which is located in Figueira da Foz. The second one is Caima, which is located in Constância. And the third one is Celtejo in Rodão. So this is basically our core business. We are pulp producers. But on the side, adjacent to that, we also produce energy, like a byproduct of the pulp production process. So on the energy segment, we produce energy with two origins, two ways to produce energy. One is cogeneration, as you said. It is basically use all we can extract from the wood. So we in the pulp production process, there is a byproduct in the process of producing pulp, which is called black liquor. This black liquor goes to the recovery boiler, is burned and creates steam and therefore energy. This is called cogeneration. The other way to produce energy in this energy segment is, of course, biomass. It's what I'm here for. So biomass is really biomatter, organic matter. So when we harvest the trees, some parts of the trees don't go to the productive process, like the top of the trees, some branches, let's say the bark of the trees. So we assemble those components together, as well as the waste from the forest, and we channel them to another recovery boiler, and it is with those components that we produce energy through biomass. So basically, we use all we can, 100% of what we produce, because Altri is really, besides a pulp producer, is really a green company. So we need to bear in mind that we manage about 83.5 thousand hectares of forest. So we really are fully compliant with the FSC certification requirements. We follow the PEFC as well. So we are green by nature. Our forest management is certified. The value chain, the supply chain is also certified. Our pulp factories are also environmental compliant in a mandatory way or compulsory way, but again, voluntarily, we do tend to want to go the extra mile and aim for voluntary certification as well. So basically, I'd like to pass through the audience that we are green in our core, in our DNA. So one thing that lacked us was to bring these sustainability commitments, the environmental concerns, climate change into corporate finances. And then we think about, we can discuss later, but it is the right time to issue a green bond. And I can explain if you want.
Exactly. No, definitely. And on top of all that, you said you were also sequestering CO2, not to mention methane when it comes to biomass
that's
in
correct.
the process. So Louise made me curious. When you needed financing, you were one of the pioneers in Portugal and ventured into green bonds. Can you share with us that journey? What did it look like? What challenges did you face?
Well, we were, in fact, pioneers. We were the first Portuguese company to issue a green bond to be traded in the Portuguese stock exchange, Euronext. We had EDP was really the first one to issue a bond, but they listed in Dublin, but we were the first to issue in the country, in Portugal. So being pioneers, it involves challenges, but really opportunities. So we were like sailing into the unknown. 500 years ago, we just went on nutshells to India, and it felt like we were doing the same because we didn't have many examples to look upon, or near examples to look upon, and so it was really challenging. But again, it was we decided to do the work, the green bond framework in-house. It was in-house. We designed an in-house workflow, and this literally obliged us to gather several people within the organization in a multitask, multilateral, multidisciplinary way. We got literally around the table the engineering teams, the sustainability team, the guys from the forestry team, and well, myself as the finance guy, just gathering the bits and pieces and tried to assemble all these great inputs together. So, and we managed to create this green bond committee that did this green bond framework. So it was really a challenging process. So it was pretty much what I would like to share with you.
Thank you so much, Miguel. Now, I have a lot more questions for the four of you, but this is an interactive event. So, Stan, do we have questions online? No. Any questions? Not yet. No, not yet. Okay, so we have around 5 minutes left. Do we still have Jose Manuel?
Yes, I'm here.
Jose Manuel, one follow-up question to you. With everything that is happening internationally, if we look at the way forwards, it seems that everything would work much better if we had global collaboration. Do you see that happen, or it's going to be more like bilateral discussions, or each country standing for itself? How do you see the way forward in terms of getting where we need to get to?
I think you're absolutely right that global collaboration will be the first best, but nevertheless, I think this is a trend that's unstoppable. I think there's a large amount of people globally that realized, as you said at the beginning of your remarks, that the sustainability challenges is not a question of being a pessimist or an optimist. It's a fact, and the question is how do we address them? So I think that the policy agenda will continue. I think it will be important and desirable that it's as coordinated as possible, but I don't think that should be an excuse for slowing it down, because the problem is not slowing down. And we know that the problem continues to, if I may say, the clock continues to click, and continues to click faster in terms of more irreversible implications the longer that we take. So I think that it's for all of us to engage. We are pushing organizations, banks particularly, to start coming forward and saying, where do they want to be in this situation? Where do they see themselves in 15, 20 years? How would they like their balance sheets to be relative to where they are today? And through that discussion, to start engaging them on, well, how do you want, if you don't want your balance sheet to be in 20 years what it is today, how are you planning to make the transformation? What are you doing today to make sure that the transformation takes place, and in 15, 20 years you are where you think you want to be? And I think every organization, doesn't have to be a company, doesn't have to be a financial company, but every organization in the world and every person individually, coming back to the comment that was made by Luis before on his personal approach, all of us at our levels should be engaging in that kind of conversation with ourselves and within our organizations. Where do we want to be in 15, 20 years, and what do I need to do today to make sure I get there? And I see a lot of progress in banks, which is obviously the part that we have more interaction with in financial institutions. They really have been actively engaging. Good practices include, for instance, having a ESG committee at the board level or a high senior management level that provides clear guidance on this front. I think large organizations are already there. Many others are working in that direction. I would say that that's a very concrete first step in governance that they should try to pursue going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose Manuel. Luis, you mentioned a key expression a while ago on your on the answer to the second question, and it might be a magical formula or structure to achieve the SDGs. You mentioned blended finance. It's still a little bit of an unknown term in some parts of the world, and every time I mentioned it in Portugal,
you see eyebrows raising. Yeah, it's still new. It's still unknown. So blended finance is very simple. It's to address a problem with private capital and banking finance at the same time. Okay. This is key for developing countries once again. It will be the most important, or it should be the most important source of finance in these countries. I've talked before about our foundation. What we have seen up to now is all these helping programs in developing countries is all mostly in the hands of foundations. It's not in the hands of private investors or developed banks or banks coming from developed countries. There are a lot of problems with this, and there is a reason for. First, this kind of finance is a long-term finance, or the returns from that finance are long-term returns. And investors and banks in the developed world are used to short-term returns. So this is something that has to change. Then there are a lot of barriers. First barrier is regulatory. Regulators still don't understand this, and this is a barrier for banks or private investors to invest in this because they will be penalized if they do so. Then there was a lot of talk about data before. The data of a lot of these projects, and this is fine with the foundation, but it's not fine for a private investor or a bank. A lot of data coming from these projects are not reliable data, or it's very difficult to get. So it's very difficult to evaluate these assets when we start financing them. Okay. Another barrier are the developing countries' governments themselves. They don't make life easier for blended finance. They need to set up rules to attract investments or create programs to attract foreign investment for this kind of finance. It's still at a very early stage, although it's extremely urgent to speed up things in this area, because if you ask, if you start asking banks or funds or whatever, what is the percentage of their portfolios in blended finance? If you do a survey, it will be 0 or 1%, and 1% will be, I'm being optimistic.
Exactly. Yeah,
So,
most of the institutions doing
it will be 0.
are multilateral financial institutions.
Exactly.
Mostly. So as Jose Manuel mentioned before, the need for global coordination is
Exactly.
I'm sorry that Louis Laginia left. We could have a good conversation with him.
I've already talked with him about this, so...
Richard, do we still have you? Richard?
Yeah, I'm with you. Absolutely.
Oh, good.
Hang on, Edward.
So we have like 2 minutes left. I have one question for you and one for Miguel. Richard, can commercial banks be the next disrupted sector like Uber did with the taxi industry and Airbnb with the hotel industry? I mean, with all the challenges that we see popping
absolutely.
left and right.
I mean, I used to talk about, and going back to my earlier metaphor, that everyone was talking about the Uberization of banking. So I got a bit bored with that. I started calling it the Teslaification of banking. You think about that. That was an organisation that was a kind of a tech firm on the West Coast, and it took on the big auto manufacturers with this lithium-ion electric thing, and a whole new business model, whole new value chains. And the incumbent said, look, it's never going to happen. And now, obviously, we know the story. We know the capitalization of Tesla. Now, the thing that's interesting about it as a disruptor story is that it was really bought on the predication that they didn't just go, we're going to go into being a car company, and we're going to think about just being an electric vehicle company. They just took a totally new vision, and they said, we're going to do the energy innovation business. And with that, gave themselves permission to turn up that whole value chain upside down, from solar panels to electric charging to vehicles and so forth. If you take that forward to banking, the Amazons, the Alibabas, the Ant Financials, these organizations will have that mindset, and they will partner with the banks where the regulation is critical. They will become the distribution player. The key thing is they will gather the data, and the data really is what's going to inform the product, and the product will inform the profitability. If you go
I mentioning reputation. And reputation is a key factor in the banking sector and capital markets.
In all sectors.
And we word about greenwashing. So this biomass endeavor was basically, I did mention we already had 4 biomass power plants. This was to finance our 5th and biggest biomass, the 34.5 megawatt biomass located at the Selby mill. So it was an investment around 80 million euros, and we were raising 50 million to that endeavor. And we specifically created a company. So we had a company for that special, it was basically SPV, fully owned by Altri. We had a company, a project, an investment, a capital expenditure, and a financing. So the user proceeds, which was 50 million, were all channeled to the 80 million capex expenditure. So no greenwashing. I already explained.
So you ring-fenced everything.
Yeah. Yes. It what makes sense, because I'm not judging the other companies that do multi-purposes or general purposes green bonds, but this way we are bulletproof, solid, crystal clear, and I think that's what we once should do. So just to go back, if I would do it again, if I have another project similar to this, of course, I would. And I also heard the term fear. I want to advise the others which may be or not, or thinking about, or in the ramp up process to engage a green bond. Don't succumb to fear. So we were like sailing to the unknown, but Vasco da Gama ended up in India. So we had a great outcome. It was hard. I'm not saying it was a walk in the park. It wasn't, but it gave us the extra kick. So I would definitely do it again. We did it, and it was an in-house work. But you have consultants that can help you. You have the banks. There is know-how already available. You can reach your fellows at other companies. You can reach me if you want. I'm always glad to help. Don't be scared. So don't be scared to sail in the great waters, because we talked about pricing. When I started going to the conferences about sustainable finance and green bonds, people used to say, well, investors are or will be willing to abdicate some yield in order to get a green bond into their portfolios. I think that's quite true, but I guess we are in a path that it's no longer the case. You need to be green.
Exactly.
If you're not on the boat, on the jolly ride, you will be penalized.
Yeah.
So don't be afraid.
Exactly. Well, as Herbert famously wrote a long time ago, fear is the mind killer. So whenever there's fear, we need to face it and move past it. And for all of you, all of those out there, if you want to know more about green bonds in Portugal, you have the two gurus right here. Thank you all, Jose Manuel, Luis, Miguel, and Richard. Thank you for your time.
Pleasure.
And well,
Thank
it
you.
was a pleasure.
Thank you.
to meet
Thank you very
and to
much.
exchange views with you.
Thank you.
It's a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
answer that we haven't really notioned out. We talked about reputation, we talked about fear, we talked about trust. Do people really trust the financial sector post 2008? So there seems to be an urgency for the banking business to change. Some of these changes are just not for the financial sector. Louise, as you mentioned before, that economy is everything, but is economy measuring the right things? Maybe it's not. So some of these changes, like with the economy, are regulatory changes. Some of them are behavioral. In some countries, what we've seen is the private sector leading the charge and regulation following suit. That is particularly true in emerging markets that face this issue on a daily basis. They see much more.
Changing. We had many regulatory initiatives in the past 2 years, either through new legislation, either through amendments to existing legislation, either to guidance. We also have the supervisors pushing for this ESG transition, but as you mentioned, you also have the question of the banks embracing the sustainability transition. Because if you see what happened in the past year, we had 130 banks signing the principles for responsible banking. Just to give you an idea of the numbers involved, it was they represent more than 1/3 of the global amount under management. That is to say, over 47,000 billion US dollars. That was the compromise. Among the signing banks, so you're talking about big banks, but you also have Caixa Geral de Depósitos has a founding bank of the principles for responsible banking. We have several other banks that have presence in Portugal. Sign the principles. You got, of course, BBVA, you got Santander, Abanca, Deutsche Bank. So you have this strong commitment that was made at the global level, and they also have a strong commitment that was made at national level. Also, last year, the Portuguese banking associations and many of its banks also signed the letter of commitment to promote sustainable financing in Portugal. Sofia was much involved in that. She did an excellent job with all the work on that. But that is to say, by signing that, the Portuguese banking sector committed to promote the debate about sustainability at the highest levels. Like the chairperson of IBA was saying, you've got to start from the top, or else it won't work. So we have the commitment to promote the debate about sustainability at the highest level, and about risks, and about opportunities, and to consider them in the banking business strategy. That is very important. You also have the commitment to integrate step by step the ESG criteria into the analysis of investment and financing by these banks, and also to promote training in sustainable finance. I would say that Portuguese banks are embracing the ESG agenda. They are taking ESG to the highest levels of the organization. New products are being developed, tested, and commercialized. We can talk about energy efficiency loans. We can talk about structured deposits that are linked to the performance of companies with good ESG factors. We had the mention also of the question of green commercial paper, the question of green bonds. So they are very active on the so-called green underwriting. So we had green bonds from EDP, Pestana, Altri recently. We also have banks now offering carbon neutral deposit accounts. They are mostly aimed at millennials. And we also have our national wealth managers that are more and more moving to ESG investing. So that is to say, I would believe there is a strong commitment also at national level.
So, João, as you know, I've moved to Portugal recently, and I'm still trying to get my head around all the European regulatory framework and then what's specific to Portugal and what not. So from what you're saying, it seems that, do you think, how is this all these frameworks and all these regulatory models impacting the financial sector in Portugal? It seems from what you said that, you know, banks are getting creative around it.
Yeah, banks are getting creative, but there's also the issue of the regulatory environment that's changed a lot in the past years. It is going to change even more in the future. So we have many measures that appeared. We can split them roughly in two blocks. Ones are prudential measures. We had the Bank of Portugal, the bank, we'll have the Bank of England, we have also EBA. But basically what I will say is the importance of integrating ESG factors in the risk management frameworks, and also to incorporate that in the business strategy. You got EBA was given several mandates. One has to do with the so-called green supporting factor or the brown penalizing factor, that is to differentiate bank exposures. You also have the ECB, that for the second year in a row considered climate risk as the key risk for the banks in the euro area. The ECB has now a draft guide on the expectations it has to the banking sectors. It is a draft, it is non-binding, but it clearly sets the expectations and they're very high. These are so-called prudential measures. If you go to the conduct measures, there are many more. I'll go briefly on that. You got banks are subject to the non-financial reporting directive, so it is currently under revision. But last year we also had the publication of the guidelines on climate-related reporting. You also have the disclosure regulation that will apply soon, that is April 2021. You got it is also related to the new regulation on sustainability benchmarks, let's call them so. And we also have the integration of ESG in MiFID that is ongoing. And you also have some voluntary initiatives, let's say like EU Green Bond Label, the Eco Label for financial products. So that is to say, you have all these regulatory ESG tsunami, but I think more important than to focus on that, of course banks have to comply with that, is what you mentioned before. We have to look at the right side, so we have to look at the opportunities that will come, and that for me is crucial because you have the European Green Deal investment plan that wants to mobilize at least 1,000 billion euros in a decade until 2030. You also have the European Commission that presented the renewed sustainable finance strategy, where it basically says that sustainable finance will be essential in the recovery of the COVID-19 crisis. You also have, for instance, the European Investment Bank that said that from the end of this year, it is happening now, it will be align all its activities with the Paris Agreement, and it expects to have more than 50% of financing related to sustainable issues by 2025. So you have, of course, this sense of, let's say, regulatory urgency to comply with regulations, what is coming, but also this sense of opportunity because sustainable finance will be mainstream. Thank you.
So I would like now to move into the opportunity side of sustainability. This is actually not fair to you, João, because he talks about a lot about regulations, but it's his job.
A bit about opportunity in the end.
He has a creative mind, so when he's talking in public, he focuses on the other side because that's his job, but it's not the case, and we've had several conversations about this. But before that, Paulo told me that we needed to interrupt to have Sarah join in. Should I continue or continue? Okay, so let's move into the opportunity side of sustainable business. We're lucky to have with us today 3 financial institutions that are not the usual suspects. So we have Montepio Geral, Banco Montepio, sorry. We have Crédito Agrícola, and we have GoGuarantee. And I'm very happy to have you here and talk a little bit about out-of-the-box issues on the sustainable finance front. So Nuno, I would like to start with you. Nuno, MP. I would like to start with you. José Campar, I don't think you were here, shared with us earlier today. He was sharing with us his views on COVID-19 and the impact on sustainable finance, and actually also broader impacts. Montepio, which makes you and your institution not unusual suspects, has a very strong mandate. So can you share with us what that mandate is, and if you think that COVID-19 may actually empower you much more to develop the social agenda?
Thank you, Miguel. First, let me just say thanks for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be with João, which is steering the Portuguese Banking Association work on this field, and I've been following it and my colleagues. And very pleased to be with you. We met when I was at the World Bank for 14 years, and I'm also slightly intimidated because Miguel is one of the persons I know that is more knowledgeable about these issues, and so I hope he bears in mind while I exhibit my ignorance for a moment. So Banco Montepio, if you think about the framework of ESG, for tradition, for its DNA, it was founded by a mutualité where people would pool resources together to somehow complement their social protection. So we have a strong mandate, a strong origin, a strong tradition, and a strong position, I would say, on yes of the ESGs. We've been that manifests in several issues. We have a strong liaison with institutions of what we call the social economy, where we have a nice market share. We have a devoted team only to those institutions: social economy, social entrepreneurship, microcredit, and all this field, which came from tradition, but has been, of course, updated and modernized for the new financial products that are at our disposition. We are now, of course, trying to complement the other legs of the sustainability agenda. Of course, we're doing our internal jobs. We switched all our auto fleet to electric and hybrids. We cut with plastics, all these things that have been done, which, by the way, in a bank is like 400,000 units per year of less plastic cups, just to give a dimension of what is consumed. We signed the commitment with the government, regulators, and our competitors on the promotion of sustainable finance in Portugal last year. We are planning in the next few months announce some initiatives on this. But of course, coming back to I think the pandemic put us, as we know, a big stress in families and companies. I think we're with changes in work, home, and dynamics that are at a pace that we don't fully understand where they will end. And of course, we keep prepared with financial products that we already have, being it for mortgage on sustainable or energy loans, or even on some social protection schemes that we associate with some financial products to help families that will be certainly badly hurt by this crisis. We need to recognize that we don't know yet where will be the end position. We're all here still in the middle of a crisis. We don't really understand where it will end. But I'm pretty sure that social dimension of the sustainability agenda will gain some preeminence after the crisis.
Okay. Thank you. So, in the previous So I have a follow-up question to you. We need to have Sarah from Bank of England.
Please, please.
Right now.
Go ahead.
So now I would like to welcome Sarah Beaton, who is the Executive Director of the Bank of England, and will enlighten us on how the institutions she represents invest in climate change and how they are setting the stage for the financial sector.
You're on.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Perfect. Yes. Perfectly.
Great. Well, look, many thanks for inviting me to talk to you today. It's an honour to be here. For those of you that don't know me, I'm the executive sponsor for all of the bank's work on climate change, a role that I've held for the last 4 years or so, and I'm thrilled that you've asked me to talk about sustainable finance and climate change, even in the midst of a global pandemic. That's because our economy and our financial system, with the right support, should recover from COVID-19, whereas climate change left unchecked will leave us with irreversible harm for generations to come. And it's a timely request as well. We're at the start of a critical decade for climate action. The decisions that we take now are going to shape the future of our planet for decades to come. Many of us have a role to play in delivering an economy-wide orderly transition to net zero emissions, but it's our view at the Bank of England that the financial sector and financial regulators should be instrumental in driving that change. And so what I wanted to do today was talk you through how we're thinking about that in the UK, and which of course is being very actively pursued through the finance track for COP26, which the UK and Italy will chair under the leadership of Mark Carney. I wanted to start very briefly with reminding us why climate change matters to financial institutions and central banks and supervisors. And that's because while it matters very obviously for the environment and for the planet, it creates financial risks too. Those financial risks can arise from the physical changes to our planet, acute weather events like the wildfires we're seeing in the United States, or longer-term climate trends like the rise in sea level. But they can also arise from the transition risks that we might face, the changes in government policy, in technology, in consumer preferences that move us from our current emissions pathway towards one that's consistent with net zero. And I did just want to remind you all that this need to transition is not just about energy companies. It is economy-wide. It's transportation, it's agriculture, it's real estate, it's industry. Now, these risks manifest as credit market investment risks that we in the financial sector know well, but they've got distinctive characteristics and in our view require a different approach if we're to manage them well. And that's why we at the bank have been particularly focused on. The first is that these climate financial risks are far-reaching in their breadth and in their scope. They're going to affect every consumer, every corporate, every geography. Their impact is going to be correlated, non-linear, irreversible, and are therefore going to be on a much greater scale than the risks that we're used to managing. Second, these risks are simultaneously uncertain and yet totally foreseeable. I can't tell you now exactly what combination of physical and transition risks we are going to see, but I can tell you that we are going to face some combination of those risks, either physical risks as we carry on the current emissions pathway, or transition risks as we change that pathway. And neither you nor we can let that uncertainty lead to inertia and inaction. And then the final point is that the size and balance of those future risks is going to be determined by the actions we take in the next decade, and within that probably the next 3 to 5 years. So what we've been pushing for is for the financial system to take bold steps, be forward-looking, strategic in their view of the risks and the opportunities from climate change. Now, the size of this challenge is absolutely enormous. To have a 2/3 chance of getting to 2 degrees by 2050, emissions need to fall in the next decade at twice the rate at which they have risen in the previous decade. That's a hell of a change. And to have a 2/3 chance of meeting 1.5 degrees in 2050, we need to see falls in emissions every year equivalent to those that we are estimated to see in this year during a global pandemic lockdown. I hope we'll all agree that we can't afford to repeat this experience. Rather, we need to achieve net zero emissions in a different way. Now, of course, that change needs to happen in the real economy. It's consumers and corporates that create emissions, governments that regulate the real economy. But if the real economy doesn't make that change, and we head down a path of increasing climate instability or for a disorderly transition, it's the financial sector that will bear that risk. The financial system can't diversify its way out of this risk. The interactions between the real economy and the financial system run deep. If we doubted that, we have been reminded of it through our experience in the pandemic. And for the same reason, while individual investors and lenders can divest or choose not to lend, the financial system as a whole cannot. Instead, if financial risk is to be reduced, the underlying climate risks in the real economy have got to be reduced. So we need the financial system to steward the real economy in an orderly fashion to net zero through its decisions on where and how to allocate capital. So that brings me to the role of the bank. Our work is focused on building resiliency to the risk from climate change in the financial system so that the financial system can steward the real economy to that orderly transition to net zero. What does that mean? Proactively managing climate risks and preemptively reducing them by making financial decisions that take the risks and the opportunities from climate change into account. Now, how do you do that? The first step in achieving that is to have the right information. And that's why the bank has been making the case for some time for consistent, comparable and comprehensive climate disclosures. The FSB's Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD, is a go-to framework to help companies and financial institutions disclose climate-related information. And it's got huge backing. Over 1,000 companies have shown their support. But support isn't enough. We need the quantity and the quality of climate disclosures to improve. That's because climate risk is a risk we see looking forwards, not backwards. Companies with the exact same current carbon footprint today could have really different strategies for the future. One might have a clear path to net zero, another might be gambling on policy inaction, and a third might just not have realised that it's exposed to the risk. So to be decision useful, we need reporting and disclosures to move from the static to the strategic, not focused on what current carbon emissions are, but what future emissions will be, using scenario analysis to help us better understand the impact of different climate pathways. All of which suggests to me that regulators have got an important role to play in prescribing how that disclosure should occur. The second step is then for financial institutions to use this information to better understand and better manage the risks in their business. To support that, in the UK, we set out supervisory expectations for banks and insurers in April 2019, covering their governance, their risk management, scenario analysis, and disclosure of climate risks. And they're designed to ensure that firms take a strategic approach to managing this risk. Now, we've been talking to firms about how they are managing climate risk, and it's clear that they're in the early stages of developing their capabilities. Very few have implemented policies, indicators, metrics, mitigation strategies that enable them to properly manage this risk. And we recognize that there are some areas where the science, the data, the tools are not yet sufficient to estimate the risks accurately. But in these cases, firms can and firms should explore the use of reasonable proxies and assumptions to work around these issues rather than leaving the risks unrecognized. A theme that I often have is that imperfection is not an excuse for inaction. But recognizing the fact that addressing the risks and opportunities from climate change is unprecedented and a shared challenge for which nobody has a how to do it manual. We've established a climate financial risk forum that works with industry to build expertise and share best practice on this topic. And in fact, we published a guide by industry for industry in June that is designed to provide practical tools, knowledge, and case studies which any firm can use to help develop their own approach to managing these risks. In addition, while firms are tackling these issues bottom up, we at the Bank of England, consistent with our objective to safeguard financial stability, are going to approach it top down. At the end of last year, we announced that we're going to stress test the resilience of the UK's largest banks and insurers to different climate pathways. And we're going to test risks not under one, but three different scenarios. Those scenarios are going to look ahead decades, not the next 3 to 5 years. And to answer the essay question, we are going to give our banks and insurers, they are going to have to understand how their customers in the real economy are exposed to the risks and the actions that need to be taken to manage these risks. And all of that, we hope, will prompt conversations about stewardship to net zero and what opportunities an orderly transition might bring. Now, to assist firms in this challenge, we're working with climate scientists and our central banking and supervisory partners, including the Banco de Portugal, through the Central Banks and Supervisors Network for Greening the Financial System, the NGFS. And through that, we have in June published a number of reference scenarios. These scenarios provide for the first time a harmonized set of high-level climate scenarios available in a publicly accessible database where both transition and physical climate change impacts are included in a consistent way. They include economic and financial variables too, and so provide a foundation, I think, for decision useful financial and economic analysis, including stress testing, that will be as relevant for financial institutions and their customers as to us in the authorities. We're going to build on these scenarios, make them fuller, and revise them with a second iteration due to be published around the end of the year. Those scenarios are only one example of our work with international partners, and obviously that's essential because climate change is a global problem that requires global solutions. So the work we do through the NGFS, which now has 66 members from all 5 continents and include jurisdictions that are worth over half of global emissions. The work we do through the NGFS is essential. This collaborative approach turns promises into practice. And if you have a look at the NGFS website, you'll be able to see just how much we are doing to try and make management of these risks by financial firms and by the central banks and supervisors a practical reality. In addition to greening finance through this focus on reporting and information and risk, the system also needs to finance green through mainstreaming sustainable finance by focusing on the enormous opportunities that exist to support the transition and better manage the risks and deliver our third R, in addition to reporting risk, delivering return. Now, there's much talk here of ESG, which tries to attach labels to things that are doing good for our planet and will deliver better returns. But to my mind, I think we need to get more analytical, more systematic, and more objective about trying to understand what a set of assets is delivering in terms of the future climate outcome. And some asset managers have been focused on one particular aspect of this, degree rating their portfolios. Allianz, AXA, the Japanese government pension fund have all committed to disclose that their portfolios are delivering a temperature outcome of, for example, 3.8 degrees. That's the path that the companies in their portfolios are currently on. And these asset managers are going to commit to make that a path to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. And those sorts of measures, in my view, are a grounded way of indicating what the financial system's doing, how it could do more in facilitating the move to net zero that we all need. I've talked for a long time. Let me leave you with my headlines, and there's probably an opportunity for a couple of questions if you have time. I really think we're in a better place than we were 5 years ago, with now a widespread recognition that climate change is a financial risk. But that means we've entered the difficult second phase, where we have to answer the question of how to turn that aspiration to better manage those risks into action. We need to collect data, build tools that enable changes in strategy, and make this part of business as usual risk management. And we're making good progress, but it's tough. The third phase, the one that we absolutely need to be approaching soon, is the most important one, where we use these tools to make financial and business decisions that progress us on an orderly transition to net zero, and where we develop metrics that assure us that collectively we're doing enough. All of that requires us to be strategic, not responsive in our actions. We need to stretch our horizons and be brave, taking different decisions today a long time before the consequences of our inaction might be clear. But it's not all doom and gloom. focusing on the risks will help us identify the enormous opportunities that exist to better manage those risks. And the innovation that follows from that will be good for business as well as good for the planet. But there's an awful lot to do. Our work could, however, not be more important. I think what's fantastic is that we are working together as we do so. Maybe I'll end there. Thank you.
So, Sarah, I'm Miguel. Thank you so much for your remarks. We started this conversation earlier today about data. How data is important, quality of data, and if the quality and reliability of data is not there, it's going to be very difficult to make this progress from data to information to knowledge and then to wisdom. So thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. I'm not sure if there's any questions from us here. Thank you so much for your time. We'll hear from Pablo afterwards. But thank you for dedicating us and sharing with us your comments. Okay? Thank you. So, I'm going to. I'm sorry.
Das das costas.
I wasn't going to say this, but you started. It's kind of difficult to ask you questions because we had countless coffees and drinks talking about these issues. So Sarah was talking about data. Richard peers before talked about data, how quality is important, how we originate. But it seems that not just from the point of view of data collection, but also regulation, there's a much stronger focus on everything that is environmental.
Yes.
Social is equally a very important variable. We're doing all of this because of the social equity, because it's people. So the question I asked was around the current regulatory framework. Does it make it more difficult for a financial institution like yours to develop social products and services?
So let's focus on the pandemic now.
Yeah.
What happens is that, of course, authorities gave the moratoria that helped families and corporates, and that's, I think, everybody agrees that was needed, an emergency. But of course, that created a lot of stress on banks' capitals, and of course, regulators also relieved a little bit of it. That creates a big uncertainty on what's going to happen next. First, because we don't know when moratoria will end. Well, we know it's March now, but this is sleeping, and we never know if it's going to be. It's a moving target because it depends on the things that are not purely financial or economic. It depends on vaccines. So that if you manage a bank, that's too much uncertainty to be better at this time. A lot of the banks, and I know they have big chunks of capital frozen. So because of RWAs that need to be allocated to financial. So at this stage, I think it's more a matter of market conditions. I think we will need to have a big effort on S of the ESG framework after the pandemic, and I think certainly we need to be creative in finding, adapting some of the exposures, especially of lower middle class and poor families have to the financial sector, being it, extending terms, changing some terms of the contracts, but and that will need a push from regulators and a change and an adaptation for those specific cases. At this stage, because of the uncertainties of the health situation, I wouldn't risk what's going to happen, but I certainly think that this will be the debate in the first half of next year, as I'm assuming that moratoriums some of them will extend a little longer than they are right now. Although that's not yet decided, but I would assume that's, if there's no new vaccine or I think that's where things will go.
We hear again that word, that important word, which is cooperation.
Yeah, that will need to, until now regulators showed a good understanding of the issues. But the challenge is the timing of the end of this crisis, if there will be an end as we try to rationalize. Depending on that, we'll need to have some more adaptations, and certainly for certain types of clients, if you want to really avoid a social, I would say, tragedy after the monetary end, we will need to have some specific actions to a lot of the, I would say, lower middle class and poor families.
I remember one of the most beautiful descriptions of sustainability I've ever heard was in Africa when I was working with cocoa farmers, and they told me, sustainability is like embracing a baobab. You cannot do it by yourself.
Exactly.
So we all need to embrace this baobab, whatever its name is. It's now COVID-19.
Exactly.
But there's a lot more there. Thank you, Nuno. So, Sophia, going to you. A lot of times when we talk about the financial sector, financial institutions, we tend to forget a very important piece in all of this, and that's the client. And when we remember the client, we usually think about the big clients, the big corporate clients. Nuno just mentioned the smallholder families. So, Crédito Agrícola, it's extremely active in the SME market, right? What I would like to ask you is, I know that you have a brand new sustainability strategy that you help craft. Can green products be good for SMEs? What are the advantages to SMEs of selling them sustainability-based products and services?
Okay, first of all, let me just clarify something. So I work as an independent specialist in different areas of sustainability. And in Portugal, within the financial sector, I work with the Crédito Agrícola. So I'm helping Crédito Agrícola to move forward on this journey. So that's my umbrella today. It's free speech and helping Crédito Agrícola to move forward, because this is a very good way of doing things. So answering your question, well, of course, SMEs, they need to embrace this topic. They need to become more informed. And they will be the real players of all of this, because the large majority of our economy around Europe and all over the world is SMEs in terms of job creation. And we could see that with this pandemic, with this crisis, we had big companies that were already not so strong, they failed, or their management probably was not as positive as we would expect. But the main sector that was really damaged is the SMEs, and that's where the unemployment comes, and that's where all the subsidies are needed, because it's not possible to pay salaries if the economy is not working. So the key sector, and of course, large companies, they have a massive impact because they buy things from the SMEs, so in terms of the value chain. But at the end of the day, it's the SMEs that create the jobs that we need to have in place for a country to be safe and to be fair. So, and if we take into account just something that we didn't refer throughout in all of this session, but I think it's crucial to understand that the speed that we need to move forward, and to understand that we can't waste any time thinking if this is even a topic. So, if the world doesn't change within, by the end of this century, we are not going to be here, but my son will be in the middle. Yeah, he has 8 years old, so he will be old, but he'll be around. And all of our grandsons will be in this planet, and we'll be dead. So for us, it's not a problem what we don't do today. So if you do nothing, by the end of this century, the average temperature of the planet will go up for 4.6. Okay, if we do nothing, which means that in Portugal the average temperature can go up 8 to 10 degrees. So imagine what will be the country look like if more than 50% of the days in Lisbon the temperature will be higher than 35 degrees Celsius. So this is what we're talking about. So in order for this not to happen, the whole world got together and decided, okay, we don't want this to happen, so the temperature, we need to become, in order to avoid this 4.6, we know that we somehow, we as humans, we handle 1.5 degrees increase, 1.5, 2 degrees maximum increase by the end of this century. We know that somehow we will survive, because we don't know what will going to happen if it's going to be above 2 degrees. So that's why we are talking. That's why this conversation is taking place, because we need to decrease the level of temperature that will go up by the end of the century. So we can only do stuff, and our economic model can only create 1.5 degrees Celsius of increasing temperature by the end of this year. Okay. Well, at the moment, the world is already 1 degree hotter in this scale, so which means that the whole world only has a chance to go up 0.5 degrees until the end of the century. Okay, and the Mediterranean, where we live, the temperature is already 1.5 higher than the level that we are starting looking at. So basically, either we all decide to go on this path, or, I mean, we are going to leave a massive damage to our families all over the world, because this is really happening now, and the COVID is also a consequence of all of these environmental issues and the way we as economic system work, and as we economic system do not really take into account properly the social and the human side of the story. It's always connected with somehow the way we have learned that in order to be successful, we need to maximize profits, and that the consequences, someone will suffer the consequences. But the beautiful thing is that now we are suffering the consequences. So, and the SMEs are suffering the consequences. So in order to answer to your question, answer your question it is a need for SMEs to understand this issue. And of course, once it's very easy for them to understand, because many of them are already feeling the consequences, imagine in wine, in crops, with the drought. So many of the activities related with the agriculture and with the production of food and beverage, they are already feeling this, which means that in terms of the financial sector, it makes complete sense to be a partner of this activity, partner of the clients, trying in one hand to help them to understand the problem and helping to find the solutions. And of course, in order to do that, you need to have some financial products that will be able to walk along. So this is part of the journey that I'm also engaging with Crédit Agricole. It's something that it doesn't happen suddenly, because there are large institutions, and despite the fact that it's a cooperative, so there is always a different culture from the typical commercial banks, but it is a large corporation. We need to change mentalities, we need to move forward and accelerate, and we are not used to accelerate on this area. So my final point to answer to your question is that definitely SMEs and green financial products, they go together, and we need to move much faster.
Just for the sake of us all, a little caveat on what Sophia mentioned. She's actually leaving very traditional, because we now know that the sinkholes that we started seeing beginning of the summer in Siberia, it's actually methane being released, so permafrost is going, and methane is something like 48 times more toxic than CO2. So, yeah, the urgency is there. But Sophia, the other thing on when it comes to SMEs, we talked a lot today about collection of information, packaging information, reporting, and all of that. So most of the reporting required, it's mostly, and understandably so, it's mostly to the big boys in the block. What about SMEs? Because without those calculations on their tables, it might make it more difficult for them to understand the urgency of the issue.
Yes, that's a crucial aspect in the banking sector, which is how do I know, how can I get this information in terms of CO2 exposure and other sorts of risks from the SMEs. So, I mean, there is also a big conversation in Europe around also asking companies, SMEs, to provide that sort of information, and I think it would make sense to have, as Richard referred in the first presentation, some sort of platform like the LinkedIn where SMEs will insert the data, and we can identify very basic data that they could insert there. But at the moment, because that database doesn't exist, what we are trying to do at Crédit Agricole is to try to identify proxies that would allow us to understand or to estimate some kind of risk, environmental risk that a company could be engaging on. So, and again, as the speaker from the Bank of England, we don't have that data, but that's not an excuse to do nothing. We have to be creative, and with the data we have, and with the proxies, and with the spirit, because one thing is the taxonomy that's really demanding, and another thing is the spirit of this taxonomy. So usually I say, well, we need to find the variables that embed the spirit of the taxonomy, even if that specific expression is not on the taxonomy, but is the spirit that we need to understand and to gather that information. So that's the exercise we are doing. It's difficult, and soon we'll be asking companies to provide us with more information. We are always trying to do this in a simple manner, always thinking that, well, the SMEs cannot also have a massive burden on the top of them in terms of data, but also the SMEs, they need to understand that once they are able to provide with some information, they will understand much better the issue, so they will manage the risk in a better way. And because SMEs are very pragmatic, they will also very quickly understand some business opportunities that they can create out of this challenge. So this is what we are doing. Data is important, and I really think the SMEs should start also disclosing more data and putting that data publicly available. It would be good for everyone, including for themselves.
Thank you, Sophia. So, Nuno, good to finally put a face to the name.
Likewise.
You coined a phrase that became very famous in Portugal and abroad as well. That was "people are the new banks." What has been your crowdfunding experience in Portugal? I mean, you are a very special type of crowdfunder because you are one of the very few, if not the only one, even internationally, that has an eligibility criteria for the projects you invest in that is fully aligned with the SDGs.
Yes.
What has been your experience?
Well, first of all, thanks for the invitation, for being here. And I wouldn't say that phrase became famous nationally or worldwide, but I think that you read it at least, so that's good. So GoParity is basically a crowd lending platform. So what we do is we provide people and companies with the opportunity of lending money directly to projects that are in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. So let's say if any company has a project that they want to start, like solar panels on your roof or a circular economy project, as long as it fits with one of the specific objectives of the SDGs, that makes it an eligible project for GoParity. We started in 2017. Actually, I wanted to start GoParity in 2012. But then there was lack of regulation in Portugal to do that, so we lost a bit of first mover advantage actually by not taking the risk of operating in a gray area. But when regulation finally came out, then we started operating in 2017, and our experience so far has been, of course, interesting and challenging at the same time, because when you're in the crowdfunding space, it's very interesting. Because there's no such thing as balance, just like in nature. You have projects, you need investors. You have investors, you need projects, and you keep trying to juggle the two balls at the same time. But I think we've been trying to do, of course, we are fast to act, and we've been growing and reinventing features and ourselves. But we've been observing quite a steady growth. So now we have more than 7,500 users. We have raised more than 2.6 million euros to fund 40 projects. Where we have seen the biggest, maybe the most significant jump now is in in March, we had only projects in Portugal, and right now we have funded projects in 5 different countries in the world: in Brazil, Colombia, Uganda, Eswatini, and Portugal. And we have more projects to come. So I think that this is kind of the exciting stage where we are right now. And about the sentence, I guess it's pretty obvious, but what I mean with that sentence is that our value proposition is actually for people to choose directly what they do with their money. And of course, our differentiation comes from tangibility, that with GoParity, you can choose exactly what you're doing with your money. So, it's real economy, generating real economic value, and paying back with interest, and with a positive impact. So it's all about empowerment of the citizen, or the end client, let's say.
Thank you. So before, we had a conversation around fintech. And we all know that technology is disruptive and it's cross-cutting. So we gave examples like Uber and those types of examples. But where do you see fintech going? And do you think fintech has the power to further sustainability and sustainable finance agenda going forward?
I think it's every time I move, I make something happen on the speakers. I'm sorry. So about fintech and where it's going, I think one of the major trends that we can see in the fintech space, it's actually that there is a lot of segmentation going on and specialization. So, for example, if you look back 10 years from now, I think you look at financial institutions and you have banks. And banks do everything from A to Z. They lend money for the consumer, they lend money to buy a car, they offer investment, they offer savings, they offer current accounts, money transfers, whatever you can think of. On everything you depended on a bank to do. And I think what fintech is bringing now to this sector is actually specialization. So you have fintechs that are specialized on transfers and on insurance and on sustainable investment and on mortgage loans. So I think the trend that we are seeing now is this one, and of course there's also a geographical diversification of the power that each institution has, because suddenly you have a lot of them. And competition is also healthy. Of course, we're not, as Sophia said, it doesn't mean that it has to be competition for the highest profit possible. But if you have competition, then in the end, the user is probably going to be the biggest beneficiary of all this. And some will fail, and some will grow, and some will be acquired, and some will merge. But in the end, I think with fintech, we're doing big favor again to citizens and companies that actually use financial services, instead of having to rely on only the 5 or 6 or 7 banks that compose the typical oligopoly in a good sense, not in a bad sense, but it's the reality that they usually have available for them.
You mentioned a critical word there, which was the citizen, because as you all remember at Davos, beginning of the year, when the world was a very different place, they were talking not about the next version of capitalism, and it was stakeholder capitalism, right?
Yeah.
And all stakeholders need to be involved, but in the end, a good company is a company that delivers value to society.
Exactly.
Right, so my apologies, I'm looking back because I know we're running late, and we still need to give time to Laura. So any questions from you? Sorry we're cutting this short, but we are getting really late. Thank you so much for your time. It was good to see you and to meet you. Thank you so much for your very pointed comments. Thank you.
Se pensa que já viu tudo, ainda não viu nada. Ou já viu um banco capaz de tornar a sua vida mais simples? Um banco pensado para os novos tempos, que não importa onde, está sempre lá. Um banco de confiança, sustentável e com visão de futuro, para que possa ver sempre mais à frente. Se pensa que já viu tudo, o Crédito Agrícola tem muito mais. Fale connosco, há tanto mais para ver. Crédito Agrícola, o Banco Nacional com pronúncia local.
Arrangements for this food for thought. I will try to follow with my presentation. Let's see how this goes. We had some technical issues. And well, to speak last in this kind of conference is both easy and difficult because everyone pretty much said all the interesting things and new things there are to say. And everyone is getting a little hungry, so I think I will have to move forward. I would therefore like to focus my presentation on the green financial market side and approaching it from three perspectives: investors, issuers, and regulators. As we all are aware, the coronavirus, COVID-19, has shaken Europe and the world to its core and tests our healthcare, welfare systems, our societies, and our ways to work and live with each other, working together. This is why the European Commission has put forward its proposal for a major recovery plan, and to ensure that this is, among member states, even and sustainable, to create a new recovery instrument, the Next Generation EU, embedded with a powerful and revamped long-term EU budget. To kickstart the economy, to create the conditions to a recovery led by private investments in key sectors and technologies. This investment is particularly crucial to the success of Europe's green and digital transactions. The Commission estimates that investment needs amount to at least 1 trillion euros in 2020 and 21. This is investment in key sectors and technologies, from 5G to artificial intelligence, and from clean hydrogen to offshore renewable energy. The Commission is also proposing to strengthen InvestEU, Europe's flagship investment program, to mobilize investment across the Union in areas such as sustainable infrastructure and digitalization. As you can see, EU legislators and financial service regulators will be very active in forthcoming years as far as sustainable finance is concerned. I will try not to bore you with the detail and densification of all of these, but as you can see, and also going through the Portuguese presidency works during 2021, there will be a quite active agenda on the sustainable finance side. So, where do we stand as a regulator? The CMVM has been actively engaged in the sustainable finance topic way before the hype. Our 2018 annual conference was dedicated to the debate on how the financial system can contribute to the development of more sustainable markets and economies, and the role that regulators must play in it. We have also been actively participating in the international groups dedicated to sustainable finance, both in IOSCO and ESMA. One of the 5 priorities established for the CMVM for 2020 is to contribute to reinforcing sustainable finance practices and to monitor financial innovation. This will be achieved by designing and implementing a supervisory model for non-financial information disclosed by issuers, including reporting information on environmental, social, and corporate governance factors. One of our supervision priorities for 2020 is to support the market in integrating sustainability factors in the preparation of a new regulatory framework regarding sustainable finance and providing guidance for the adoption of these good practices. We have currently ongoing a public consultation. This will be ongoing up to 30 September for the draft report model for the disclosure of non-financial information by issuers of securities. So you will be most welcome to provide us our feedback on that. In February 2019, we launched a public consultation, a reflection document on sustainable finance. Well, we aim to have a view on the Portuguese landscape regarding sustainable finance and to interact with the market on this. And what did we learn? The results of this public consultation were published. They are publicly available on our site. And as you can see, the major risks and difficulties identified have been, as we have already discussed here today, poor data quality and lack measurement standards, reporting and compliance costs of the new rules, greenwashing, development of proper risk models, implication of new rules in daily operations, and how to move the focus from short-term to long-term objectives and practices. In terms of the regulator role, market participants expect us to inform and issue recommendations to investors to assure permanent communication with relevant stakeholders in order to explain and make feasible this new framework, to clarify and harmonize non-financial disclosure rules, and to prevent greenwashing. This is quite a prescient evaluation by Portuguese corporate and financial systems, especially if one considers that sustainable finance is still largely unknown to most investors and to most SMEs. This diagnosis is in fact very much aligned with the concerns and challenges pointed out by other jurisdictions. So how are demand and supply dealing with sustainable finance? The discussion, I feel, is often centered on companies and their responsibility, on the corporate purpose, on Milton Friedman's paradigm that is now changing. But consumers, and in our case, financial services consumers, meaning investors, have an immense power to push for change. If consumers increase the demand for sustainable products and investments, then companies have little option than offer those products. Otherwise, they will be out of business soon. And this is why we believe much of our role as regulators involve working with and for the investors, endowing them with the tools they need to be informed and thus autonomous and responsible. There is a clear overall trend towards ESG-related investments. Sustainability has been growing on investment concerns, but also there has been an increased interest from the industry in responding to that demand. This reflects the rising of sustainable investments, either through green bond issuance or sustainable investment funds, which, by the way, we now have been able to see that have ensured better performance during the pandemic times than the other type of funds which do not incorporate sustainable investment practices. The results of a survey commissioned by Allianz Global Investors tell us that 75% of retail investors are interested in sustainable investments, 40% believe sustainable investing has positive impact, but only 20% of the respondents have discussed sustainable investment with their advisor. This shows that there is a small number of investors actually turning their interest into action. In Portugal, Italy, and Spain, more than 80% of the respondents say that putting their money in sustainable-oriented investments is important or very important for them. Also, for Portugal specifically, a study by Schroders Global showed us that 41% of people would rather invest in sustainable investments, 80% say that sustainable investments have become more important, and only 24% believe that or are concerned that those deliver inferior returns compared to returns on non-sustainable investments. On the supply side, global sustainability-linked bond issuance has been led by green bonds. It became at the supranational level, then local governments, states, municipalities, and finally governments also. The latest numbers show that green bonds represent 80% of the market, while the issuance of social bonds is still scarce. We are still focusing on DE, we are still leaving the S and the G a bit outside. Issuers tend to be concentrated in finance, utility, and energy sectors, and Europe has been driving the global issuance. So now what? CMVM is well aware of the paramount role that regulators must take on regarding the subject in the scope of their public interest mission. Our focus should be creating the best regulatory and supervision conditions to avoid unnecessary barriers to the integration of ESG factors into investment models or investor choices. We have 3 new pieces of Europe legislation on this subject, and our immediate challenge as regulators and supervisors will be ensuring that everyone clearly understands that what is expected from them and convergence in the supervision of the application of this new legal framework, while enabling some degree of proportionality to take into account national specificities. To finish, to wrap up, regulators face 4 practical challenges on the coming year: definition of scope, measurements and flexibility, simple, clear and proportional regulation, harmonization of supervision, and finally, the need to avoid some traps. The uncertainty trap: regulators need to reduce market uncertainty and informational noise in order to promote the adoptions of new practices and to facilitate the right price discovery. The expectations traps: the financial community should avoid unreal expectations regarding the results and impacts of sustainable finance. In particular, we must bear in mind that the incremental approach that is currently being purposed will not be sufficient to limit the global warming to the current objectives. And also that sustainable strategies or products might imply trade-offs that require full transparency. Not all strategies will mean a better financial payoff, and surely not in the short term. Also, greenwashing. The high degree of uncertainty regarding indicators, metrics, and their validation by internal and external auditors. We might end up being asked to offer a credibility stamp to sustainable investment products and strategies. This means a credible system of rating ought to be developed, assuring a properly regulated rating industry. Thank you for your time.
as oportunidades entre todos. BBVA, criando oportunidades.
Presencial e também virtual, e terem contribuído para esta primeira discussão por parte da PSO sobre o tema do Sustainable Finance e dos Green Challenges. Vamos ter agora um breve welcome cocktail para podermos todos confraternizar. Thank you very much for those who contributed for this discussion, who was our first about the thematic of sustainable finance, and we look forward to see you soon for the next year discussion. Thank you.